is approximately where she was found.
The 17-year-old high school junior stabbed more than a dozen times.
Find out who it was before I died.
Imagine leaving your door unlocked, letting your children play freely in the streets, and never thinking twice about walking home alone. That was life in Wahoo, Nebraska, a quiet town where everyone knew their neighbors, and the worst crime was usually nothing more than teenage mischief. It was March 1969, and spring was just beginning to soften winter's edge. But beneath this peaceful facade, something sinister was stirring. For 17-year-old Mary Kay Heese, March 25th started like any other day. She walked the familiar streets of her hometown, her school books clutched to her chest, perhaps thinking about homework, or what her mother might be cooking for dinner. But as dusk settled over Wahoo that evening, Mary Kay's empty chair at the dinner table would become the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt this community for decades. What happened in those crucial hours between Mary Kay's last known sighting and the grim discovery that followed? How could a young girl vanish from the streets of a town where everyone knew everyone else? And why would it take over 50 years for the truth to finally emerge from the shadows? This isn't just another small town murder story. It's a tale of shattered innocence, of a community forever changed, and of a family's relentless pursuit of justice. But most importantly, it's the story of Mary Kay Heese, a daughter, a student, a friend, whose life was cut tragically short on a spring evening that Wahoo, Nebraska would never forget.
He allegedly murdered my cousin, brutally, threw her in a ditch and drove away.
To understand the magnitude of what was lost that March evening, you need to know Mary Kay Heese beyond the headlines that would later tell of her tragic end. She wasn't just another face in the hallways of Wahoo High School. She was the quiet force of kindness that made the ordinary extraordinary. Mary Kay's mother, Dorothy, often said her daughter was an old soul in a young body. At 17, while other teenagers were pushing boundaries, Mary Kay found joy in the simpler things. She was the daughter who'd help prepare Sunday dinners without being asked, the student who'd stay after class to help struggling classmates, and the friend who always seemed to know when someone needed a gentle word of encouragement. In the halls of Wahoo High, where she was a junior in 1969, Mary Kay wasn't part of the popular crowd, nor did she want to be. Her teachers remembered her as diligent and thoughtful, the kind of student who'd rather perfect an essay than gossip about the latest school drama. She had dreams of making a difference, though she kept them mostly to herself. Her notebooks, later found by investigators, were filled with not just schoolwork, but carefully written plans for the future. She was the responsible one, her classmates would later recall, the one you could always count on. That reliability became her trademark, whether it was volunteering at the local library or helping younger students with their homework. Mary Kay moved through life with a quiet grace that made her absence all the more devastating when it came. What no one knew at the time was that in the months before her death, Mary Kay had sensed something wasn't quite right. She never shared her concerns openly, but hints of unease would later be found in her private writings, subtle warnings that, in hindsight, took on a chilling significance. March 25th, 1969, dawned crisp and clear in Wahoo. Mary Kay rose early, as she always did, carefully selecting her outfit and packing her school books. Her mother, Dorothy, would later recall their last conversation over breakfast, ordinary words about ordinary things that would haunt her forever. The school day passed without incident. Mary Kay attended her classes, turned in her assignments, and made plans with a friend to study for an upcoming test. By late afternoon, she was seen walking near the intersection of 12th and Linden Streets, just 6 blocks from home. It was around 4:30 p.m., and the spring sun was still high enough to cast long shadows across the sidewalks. A neighbor noticed her familiar silhouette. Schoolbooks clutched close, her measured stride marking the familiar path she'd walked countless times before. But Mary Kay never made it home. As the hands of the kitchen clock crept past 5:30 p.m., Dorothy felt the first stirrings of worry. Her daughter was never late without calling. By 6:08 p.m., that worry had bloomed into fear. Calls to Mary Kay's friends yielded nothing. No one had seen her since school. As darkness fell over Wahoo, neighbors joined the increasingly frantic search, calling out her name into the growing night. Just after midnight, a passerby made the discovery that would change Wahoo forever. Along a desolate stretch of road south of town, partially concealed in a roadside ditch, lay Mary Kay's body. The scene told a story of unimaginable violence, multiple stab wounds marking a fierce struggle for life. Her schoolbooks lay scattered nearby, silent witnesses to her final moments. Law enforcement quickly cordoned off the area, but word spread through Wahoo like wildfire. Parents woke their children to check on them. Doors were locked. Phone lines buzzed with the terrible news. The sight of FBI agents arriving in their dark sedans the next morning confirmed what everyone already knew. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was the worst crime in Wahoo's history. The peaceful fabric of small-town life had been torn apart, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. They had never seen anything like this before. The investigation's numbers were staggering. Nearly 700 interviews conducted, dozens of potential suspects questioned, every square inch of the crime scene methodically searched. Yet each new lead seemed to evaporate as quickly as morning dew under the spring sun. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Mary Kay had fought for her life. Defensive wounds on her hands proved that much. The multiple stab wounds suggested rage, perhaps even personal motivation. But the killer had been careful too. No murder weapon was ever found, and rain, in the hours after the discovery, had washed away crucial evidence. We're looking for someone who knew the area well. One FBI agent told reporters, the location where she was found wasn't somewhere you'd stumble upon by accident. This revelation sent shivers through the community. Could the killer be one of their own? Detectives worked around the clock, following every possible lead. They traced Mary Kay's final walk home, interviewing anyone who might have seen something unusual that afternoon. They investigated local troublemakers, drifters who'd passed through town, even people Mary Kay had mentioned in her diary. But each promising lead eventually hit a dead end. The most frustrating aspect for investigators was the timing. In broad daylight, on a route Mary Kay walked regularly, someone had managed to abduct and murder her without leaving behind a single reliable witness. How was that possible in a town where everyone knew everyone else? As weeks turned into months, the case began to cool. The FBI agents gradually withdrew, leaving behind boxes of interview transcripts and evidence files that would gather dust for decades. For Wahoo's residents, the lack of answers was almost as terrifying as the crime itself. If the killer wasn't caught, could it happen again? And worse still, was the murderer still walking among them? In the months following Mary Kay's murder, Wahoo underwent a transformation that went far deeper than the newly installed door locks and street lights. The town's innocence hadn't just been damaged, it had been shattered beyond repair. Parents who once let their children roam freely now enforced strict curfews. The simple act of walking home from school became an orchestrated operation, with groups of students moving together under watchful adult eyes. Neighbors who had never thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked now double-checked them obsessively. We stopped being a town and started being suspects, recalled one longtime resident. Every lingering glance, every unexpected visitor, every unfamiliar car parked on the street became cause for suspicion. The murder had planted seeds of doubt that grew into thick walls of distrust. The high school halls where Mary Kay once walked became unnaturally quiet. Her empty desk served as a daily reminder of what had been lost. Teachers noticed their students growing up faster than they should have, forced to confront a darkness they weren't ready to understand. The Class of 70 yearbook would feature a memorial page for Mary Kay, a somber addition to what should have been a celebration of youth. Local businesses began closing earlier, especially during winter months, when darkness came sooner. The evening streets of Wahoo, once alive with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting, fell silent. Even simple pleasures like evening walks became tainted by an undercurrent of fear. But perhaps the most profound change was invisible to the eye. It lived in the whispered conversations between parents, in the nervous glances exchanged when strangers passed through town, and in the unspoken question that haunted every resident: was the killer still among them? This uncertainty created a wound in Wahoo's community spirit that would take generations to heal.
I promised Aunt Dorothy that I would continue to press to find out who it was.
Time has a way of healing wounds, they say, but for Mary Kay's family, each passing year only deepened the mystery of her death. As Wahoo moved forward, Dorothy Heese watched her daughter's case slip further into the shadows of history. Files gathered dust in the police station basement. Witnesses' memories faded, and the trail grew colder with each passing season. But while others might have accepted the cruel silence of an unsolved case, Mary Kay's cousin, Kathy Tull, refused to let her memory fade. "I made a promise," Kathy would later say, her voice firm with conviction. "I promised Aunt Dorothy we wouldn't stop until we found the truth." Dorothy Heese passed away without knowing who took her daughter's life, carrying that burden of uncertainty to her grave. For Kathy, her aunt's death only strengthened her resolve. She became a constant presence at the police station, making regular calls to investigators and refusing to let Mary Kay become just another cold case number. The years ticked by, 10, 20, 30, then 40. New detectives inherited the case files, each bringing fresh eyes but reaching the same dead ends. Some suggested it was time to let go, that too much time had passed. But Kathy's response never wavered. Time doesn't change what happened to Mary Kay. Throughout those decades of silence, Kathy kept meticulous records. She collected newspaper clippings, gathered family photos, and documented every conversation with law enforcement. Her home became an unofficial archive of the case, boxes filled with the kind of details that investigators might have overlooked. "People thought I was obsessed," Kathy admitted years later. "Maybe I was, but someone had to keep Mary Kay's story alive. Someone had to keep fighting for her." After decades of silence, 2024 brought a cascade of developments that would finally crack open the case that had haunted Wahoo for over half a century. It began with the decision that even Kathy Tull struggled with: the exhumation of Mary Kay's body.
I cried. I was hoping I was doing the right thing, disrupting her. But we were at a point where if that was the only option we had, we needed to do it.
The exhumation, conducted under the watchful eyes of modern forensic experts, promised to unlock secrets that 1969's technology couldn't reveal. But fate had another card to play. While sorting through her late Aunt Dorothy's belongings, Kathy made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. There, tucked away in an old box, was Mary Kay's necklace.
You got all this out for me today, and in there you found this necklace.
Yep.
And this is the same one she was wearing in her pictures. Mm-hmm. Do you think she was wearing this necklace when she was murdered?
I think she was wearing it that night. I think that the mortuary probably released this to Aunt Dorothy afterwards, or somebody did because her name's written on the bag.
More chilling still was what lay beneath it. A letter written by Mary Kay just months before her death. The words seemed to reach through time, carrying a warning no one had heeded.
We had a little trouble around our house. I haven't found out who it is yet, but I'm getting the information.
What trouble had Mary Kay sensed? What information had she been gathering?
I kept calling and calling and calling, wanting to know where the case was and if we had any new evidence. And then when we put the tip line up, and when we did that, it seems that things kind of took off.
The tip line Kathy had established years earlier suddenly crackled with new energy. People who had held their silence for decades finally began to speak. Perhaps it was guilt, or the realization that time was running out for justice to be served. Whatever the reason, the walls of silence began to crumble. Investigators, armed with modern DNA technology and these new leads, began piecing together a picture that had remained fragmented for over 50 years. The necklace, preserved in its paper tomb, yielded microscopic evidence that 1969's investigators couldn't have dreamed of finding. Mary Kay's letter provided context that transformed seemingly unrelated details into vital clues. It was like watching a photograph develop. One investigator would later say, every new piece of evidence made the picture clearer. They weren't just following a cold trail anymore. They were closing in on a killer who had walked free for far too long. As 2024 drew to a close, the investigation accelerated with an intensity that took even Kathy by surprise. Decades of dead ends were suddenly giving way to concrete leads. Justice, so long delayed, was finally within reach. On November 18th, 2024, in the quiet town of Ponca City, Oklahoma, time finally caught up with 77-year-old Joseph A. Ambrose. As U.S. Marshals moved in to make the arrest, they weren't just apprehending a suspect. They were closing a chapter that had remained open since 1969. The news of Ambrose's arrest hit Wahoo like a thunderbolt for a community that had lived with this unsolved crime for over 5 decades. The reality was almost too much to process. Here was a name, a face, an answer to the question that had haunted their town for generations. I was washing dishes when I got the call, Kathy Tull recalled, her voice breaking. My legs just gave out. After all these years, after all the dead ends and disappointments, we finally had him. The man accused of taking Mary Kay's life had been living quietly, perhaps thinking time had erased his tracks. As news crews descended on Wahoo, longtime residents struggled to reconcile their memories with this new reality. Many remembered 1969 as if it were yesterday. The fear, the searches, the candlelight vigils. Now, finally, there was a face to attach to those dark memories. The arrest sent shockwaves through both communities. In Ponca City, neighbors described Ambrose as unremarkable, someone who never drew attention to himself. In Wahoo, people struggled to remember if their paths had ever crossed with his. How had he managed to hide in plain sight for so long? For Kathy, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. I wish Aunt Dorothy could have lived to see this day, she said, touching the necklace that had helped break the case. She never gave up hope that someday, somehow, we'd find the person who took Mary Kay from us. As investigators began revealing details of the case against Ambrose, the portrait they painted was one of meticulous police work combined with scientific breakthroughs. The evidence that had seemed insufficient in 1969 now told a compelling story through the lens of modern forensic technology. The discovery of Mary Kay's necklace had proven crucial, providing investigators with DNA evidence that had been preserved unknowingly for over 5 decades, combined with information from the tip line and Mary Kay's prophetic letter. Investigators had finally assembled the pieces of this tragic puzzle. Yet some questions remained unanswered. What was the connection between Ambrose and Mary Kay? What had driven him to commit such a horrific crime? And why had he chosen to remain so close to the scene of his alleged crime for all these years? As the case moved toward trial, these questions hung heavy over Wahoo, reminding everyone that even solved mysteries can leave lasting shadows.
This is definitely by far the oldest case that I've been associated with.
We couldn't imagine anyone wanting to do anything like that to her.
May 14th, 1976. A quiet street in Oklahoma City is shattered by an unthinkable discovery. Inside a modest duplex, 68-year-old Layla Mae Johnston, a loving grandmother, a retired social worker who spent her life helping others, lies dead. She has been raped and strangled in her own home. No forced entry. Nothing stolen. Just a senseless act of violence that would haunt her family and baffle investigators for decades. Her killer thought time was on his side. He thought the passing years would bury his crimes forever, but he didn't count on the relentless march of science or the dedication of detectives who refused to let Layla's case go cold. This is the story of how cutting-edge DNA technology finally gave voice to evidence that had waited patiently for nearly half a century. This is the story of how justice caught up with a killer, even from beyond the grave.
I just couldn't believe it. After all these years, to finally have an answer.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. Oklahoma City in 1976 was a place where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where violent crime was something that happened somewhere else. The 3600 block of N. Robinson Avenue was lined with modest duplexes, each housing families who had built their lives around trust and community. Among them lived Layla Mae Johnston, a 68-year-old grandmother whose life embodied the very best of that trusting era. Born in Texas during the tumultuous years following World War I, Layla had built a life dedicated to service. Until just months before her death, she worked at the state welfare department, where colleagues remembered her as the kind of person who would stay late to help a family in need. Her retirement should have been the beginning of her golden years, a time to focus on the simple joys she loved most: sewing clothes for her grandchildren, tending to her small garden, and sharing stories over afternoon tea. Those who knew Layla described her as the heartbeat of her family. Her granddaughter would later recall how visits to grandmother's duplex were a weekly highlight, filled with the warmth of fresh-baked cookies and the gentle whir of her sewing machine. She was always making something for someone, her granddaughter remembered. That's just who she was. Always giving, always caring.
My grandmother was a very loving, caring person. She sewed fantastic. She made all my school clothes. She cared for her yard and her home. We would visit at least once a week, just spending time with her, telling stories. I felt that she was an integral part of my life.
Her home reflected her character, modest but meticulously maintained, with curtains she'd sewn herself and family photos adorning every wall. The ground floor duplex wasn't fancy, but to Layla, it was paradise. She had created a sanctuary where family gathered, where neighborhood children knew they could find a sympathetic ear, and where her own boundless love for others shone through in every detail. But beneath the serenity of this picture-perfect life, a shadow was about to fall. The same trusting nature that made Layla beloved in her community would ultimately make her vulnerable to an unimaginable act of violence. The unlocked doors that symbolized neighborhood trust would soon become a tragic reminder of how times were changing. No one could have predicted that spring morning would be the last time neighbors would see Layla tending to her cherished garden. No one could have known that the community's sense of security was about to be shattered forever. The stage was set for a tragedy that would not only claim an innocent life, but would also launch one of Oklahoma's most enduring mysteries.
Officers get a call to a resident inside of her duplex found by the neighbors.
The morning of May 14th, 1976 began like any other on N. Robinson Avenue. The spring air was warm, birds were chirping, and neighbors went about their usual routines. But something was off. Layla's curtains remained drawn well past her usual wake-up time. Her morning ritual of checking the mail and watering her beloved garden never happened. The absence of these small, everyday movements sent ripples of concern through the close-knit community. By afternoon, the worry had grown into genuine fear. A neighbor, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, decided to check on Layla. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, in her own home, the place that should have been her sanctuary, lay Layla Mae Johnston's lifeless body. The police response was swift. As patrol cars pulled up to the duplex, neighbors gathered in small clusters on their porches, watching in disbelief as crime scene investigators filed in and out of Layla's home. The area was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape, transforming a peaceful street into a crime scene that would perplex investigators for decades to come. Inside, detectives found a scene that defied explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting Layla either knew her killer or that they had entered through an unlocked door, a common practice in the neighborhood at the time. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Her purse sat untouched. Her jewelry remained in place. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The killer had come with far more sinister intentions. The medical examiner's findings were grim. Layla had been raped and strangled. The violence of the attack stood in stark contrast to the gentle soul who had lived there. Even veteran detectives were shaken by the brutality inflicted on an elderly woman who had spent her life helping others. It made no sense, recalled one of the original investigating officers speaking years later. Here was this kind, elderly lady who wouldn't hurt a fly. She had no enemies. Everyone loved her. Why would anyone do this? The neighborhood reacted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Doors that had never known a lock were suddenly bolted shut. Parents called their children inside before sunset. The trust that had defined their community was replaced by fear and suspicion. Who among them could have committed such a heinous act? For Layla's family, the news was devastating. Her granddaughter, who had visited just days before, struggled to comprehend how someone could harm her beloved grandmother.
It was devastating. We were extremely upset and confused because they didn't take anything from the house. They just took her life.
It wasn't just that we lost her, she would later say. It was how we lost her, the violence of it. It was impossible to understand. As news of the murder spread through Oklahoma City, it became clear that this wasn't just another crime. It was an attack on everything their community stood for: trust, safety, and the belief that good people were protected by their own goodness. But the worst part was yet to come. The killer had left almost no traces behind, except for one crucial piece of evidence that wouldn't reveal its secrets for nearly half a century. The Oklahoma City Police Department mobilized quickly, but from the start, investigators knew they were facing an uphill battle. In 1976, crime scene analysis was still primitive by today's standards. No DNA testing, no advanced fingerprint databases, no surveillance cameras to review. Detectives had to rely on old-school police work, door-to-door canvassing, witness interviews, and careful examination of physical evidence. Detective James Miller, one of the first investigators assigned to the case, later recalled the frustrating nature of the crime scene. Everything was neat, almost too neat, he said. It was like the killer knew exactly what he was doing, how to avoid leaving traces. But despite their best efforts to be careful, criminals always leave something behind. In this case, they had recovered crucial biological evidence. though its true value wouldn't be realized for decades to come. The investigation's first 48 hours were critical. Detectives interviewed dozens of neighbors, trying to piece together Layla's final days. Several reported seeing her working in her garden just 2 days before, appearing happy and at peace. No one had heard anything unusual on the night of the murder. No screams, no signs of struggle. It was as if evil had slipped in and out like a ghost. The hardest part was telling the family we had no solid leads, remembered Detective Miller. The lack of forced entry suggested Layla either knew her killer or that they had entered through an unlocked door, a common practice in the trusting neighborhood. But this only widened the pool of potential suspects while providing no clear direction. The crime lab worked tirelessly, processing fingerprints found throughout the duplex. But in an era before computerized databases, each print had to be compared manually to known offenders. Hair samples were collected, fibers were analyzed, and every inch of the crime scene was photographed. Yet each potential lead seemed to evaporate as quickly as it appeared. Perhaps most frustrating was the complete absence of witnesses. In a neighborhood where people typically kept their windows open in the spring weather, not a single person reported hearing or seeing anything suspicious. It was as if the killer had chosen his moment perfectly, striking when the street was at its quietest. As days turned into weeks, the case began to cool. Tips that initially flooded the police hotline slowed to a trickle. The family's hopes for quick justice faded with each passing day. But unknown to everyone at the time, the most important piece of evidence, that crucial biological sample, had been carefully preserved, waiting for science to catch up with justice. The weeks turned into months, the months into years, and Layla Mae Johnston's case slowly gathered dust in the Oklahoma City Police Department's cold case files. But for her family, time didn't dull the pain. It only deepened the wound of not knowing. Every holiday gathering, every family milestone was marked by her absence. And the haunting question, who had taken her from them?
I thought would never be finished. It had been so long. It had been, the little gnawing in the back of your head all the time that, who did this?
The 1980s came and went. New technologies emerged, offering hope to families of other victims. But Layla's case remained frustratingly opaque. Her file would occasionally be pulled out when similar crimes occurred or when a new detective took interest. But each review ended the same way, with more questions than answers. In the early 1990s, as DNA testing began revolutionizing forensic science, Layla's family dared to hope. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene had been meticulously preserved, thanks to the foresight of those original investigators. But early DNA testing was limited, expensive, and required larger samples than what many old cases could provide. Meanwhile, Oklahoma City changed around them. The quiet neighborhood where Layla had lived became busier, more urban. Many of the original neighbors moved away or passed on, taking their memories of that terrible day with them. The duplex where she'd lived was eventually torn down, replaced by new construction, as if trying to erase the horror of what had happened there. For the detectives who'd worked the case, Layla's murder became the one that got away. Some cases just stick with you, said retired Detective Miller in a 2020 interview. You go home at night and you can't help but think about that gentle grandmother who deserves so much better. You think about her family, still waiting for answers. By the turn of the millennium, most people had forgotten about the murder of Layla Mae Johnston. But in the evidence room of the Oklahoma City Police Department, a small sample of DNA still waited silently, holding secrets that would soon rock the community to its core. The landscape of criminal investigation changed dramatically in 2018 when genetic genealogy burst into the spotlight with the capture of the Golden State Killer. Suddenly, decades-old cold cases had new hope. This revolutionary technique could do something unprecedented: identify suspects through their family trees, even if they'd never been arrested or had their DNA collected. By 2023, the Oklahoma City Police Department's cold case unit decided it was time to try this new approach with Layla's case. They partnered with DNA Labs International, DLI, a private forensic laboratory specializing in the most challenging cold cases. The biological evidence that had waited patiently for 47 years was about to tell its story. When we received Layla's case, we knew we had our work cut out for us, recalled Allison Martin Krensky, DLI's lead genealogist. But there was something about this case, a grandmother murdered in her own home, that made us determined to find answers. The process was painstaking. First, the lab had to extract usable DNA from the decades-old evidence, a delicate process that sometimes fails with age samples. But Layla's case yielded a surprise. The DNA was remarkably well preserved, thanks to proper storage all those years ago. It was as if those original investigators had somehow known that someday this evidence would be the key. With a viable DNA profile in hand, Martin Krensky began the intricate process of genetic genealogy. Think of it as building a massive family tree in reverse. Instead of starting with a known person and working forward, they started with the DNA and worked backward through generations of connections. The team searched through public genealogy databases, looking for distant relatives who shared snippets of DNA with their unknown suspect. Each match was like a piece of an enormous puzzle. Some led nowhere. Others opened new avenues of investigation. For months, they traced family lines, studied birth certificates, death records, and marriage licenses. It's like finding your way through a maze, Martin Krensky explained. Every wrong turn actually helps you get closer to the right path. You just have to be patient and methodical. The team built out dozens of family trees, connecting dots that span generations and crisscross the country. Then, after more than a year of intensive work, the maze suddenly opened up. Multiple family lines converged on a single name, Charles O. Droke, born February 18, 1948. When investigators ran the name, they discovered something startling. Droke had been dead since 1989, killed by his own brother shortly after the latter's release from prison. But in 1976, Charles Droke had been very much alive, and as investigators were about to confirm, he had been in Oklahoma City, just blocks from Layla's duplex, on that fateful May evening. Charles O. Droke was no stranger to violence. Born in 1948, he'd lived a life marked by trouble, though he'd somehow managed to avoid serious criminal charges. His death in 1989, murdered by his own brother, seemed a fitting end to a life of darkness. But until the DNA results came back, no one had connected him to one of Oklahoma City's most haunting cold cases. When detectives pulled Droke's records, a chilling picture emerged. In 1976, he'd been living just a few blocks from Layla's duplex. He would have known the neighborhood's routines, understood its trusting nature. He would have seen Layla, perhaps watched her tending her garden or returning from the grocery store. The thought sent shivers down the investigators' spines. The final DNA comparison was just a formality, recalled Detective Mike Burke from the cold case unit. But when those results came back as a match, it was still overwhelming. After 47 years, we were finally looking at the face of Layla's killer. The match wasn't just close, it was definitive. The DNA found at the crime scene was unquestionably Charles Droke's. Modern science had finally given voice to evidence that had waited nearly half a century to speak its truth. But the revelation brought with it a bitter irony. Droke had escaped earthly justice, killed in 1989 before DNA technology could catch up with him. His own violent death, shot by his brother in what police at the time ruled a domestic dispute, had come just as DNA testing was beginning to emerge as a forensic tool. In some ways, it feels like he cheated justice twice, said one investigator first by escaping detection for so long, then by dying before he could be held accountable. Yet there was still power in naming him, in finally being able to tell Layla's family who had taken their beloved grandmother from them. The case also raised haunting questions. Had Layla been Droke's only victim? Given the violence of the crime and his ability to avoid detection, investigators couldn't help but wonder if there were other unsolved cases that might bear his signature. But those answers, if they exist, likely died with him in 1989. What's certain is that on that May evening in 1976, Charles O. Droke committed a crime that would take nearly 5 decades to solve. He likely thought he'd gotten away with it. He couldn't have known that the evidence he left behind would eventually speak, even if he no longer could. The identification of Charles Droke as Layla's killer marked a historic moment for Oklahoma law enforcement. It was the first time the Oklahoma City Police Department had solved a homicide using genetic genealogy, ushering in a new era of cold case investigation. But for Layla's family, the revelation brought mixed emotions. After 47 years, you almost can't believe it, Layla's granddaughter shared, her voice thick with emotion. We finally have a name, a face to put to this nightmare. But he's been dead all these years, never having to answer for what he did to our grandmother. The case changed more than just one family's story. It sent ripples through the law enforcement community, proving that even decades-old cases could be solved with persistence and new technology. This success prompted the Oklahoma City Police Department to review other cold cases, looking for those where preserved DNA evidence might tell similar tales. For DNA Labs International and their dedicated team, Layla's case became a testament to the power of genetic genealogy. Every case solved is meaningful, explained genealogist Allison Martin Krensky. But there's something special about finally giving answers to a family that's waited nearly half a century. Most importantly, Layla Mae Johnston was no longer just another cold case number. Her story, while tragic, had finally found its ending. The kind grandmother who spent her life helping others, who sewed clothes for her grandchildren, and tended her garden with loving care, had at last received a measure of justice. As this chapter closes, new questions emerge. How many other killers are out there, their crimes hidden behind the passage of time? How many other families are still waiting for answers? And how many more secrets are locked away in preserved DNA samples, waiting for science to give them voice?
2 pipe bomb explosions, one in Emeryville, the other in Pleasanton, cities unaccustomed to such violence. The feds were brought in, and soon they turned their sights on an animal rights activist.
2 explosions shattered the morning calm at Chiron Corporation in Emeryville, California. The first blast rocked the entrance, sending debris flying across the campus. But it was the second explosion, timed to detonate just as first responders arrived, that revealed the bomber's true intentions. This wasn't just destruction, it was an attempt to kill. The mastermind behind these attacks wasn't your typical bomber. No history of violence, no criminal record, no red flags. Instead, Daniel Andreas Sandiego was a clean-cut computer expert from an affluent family, raised in one of California's wealthiest communities. The son of a city manager, educated in the best schools, he seemed destined for success in Silicon Valley. So how did this privileged tech expert become the first domestic terrorist on the FBI's most wanted list? For 21 years, Sandiego would elude capture, slipping through FBI dragnets and surfacing in countries across the globe. His technical expertise, sailing skills, and network of sympathizers helped him stay one step ahead of the law. That is, until November 2024, when his luck finally ran out in the most unexpected place, a quiet village in Wales. This is the story of how animal rights activism twisted into domestic terrorism, how a man vanished for 2 decades, despite being one of America's most wanted fugitives. and how justice finally caught up with him. It's a tale that forces us to ask what turns idealism into extremism, and can someone really disappear in our modern connected world?
Does he rise to the stature of Osama bin Laden? No. But indeed, 3 acts of a violent act where improvised explosive devices were used, where potentially someone could have been seriously injured and or killed.
Berkeley, California, 1978. While the rest of the country grappled with economic uncertainty, the San Diego family welcomed their son Daniel into a world of privilege and opportunity. His father, Ed San Diego, wasn't just another Bay Area professional. He was the city manager of Belvedere, an exclusive enclave where multi-million-dollar homes overlook the San Francisco Bay. Young Daniel would want for nothing growing up in nearby Marin County, a region known for its progressive politics and stunning landscapes. On the surface, Daniel's early years painted a picture of suburban perfection. Friends and neighbors described him as intellectually gifted, particularly drawn to technology and sailing. He excelled in local schools, showing promise that seemed to justify his privileged upbringing. There were no signs, no warnings of the radical path he would eventually choose. But Marin County's progressive atmosphere may have planted the first seeds of his future activism. The region was a hotbed of environmental and animal rights movements, where passionate advocacy was as common as luxury cars in driveways. For a bright, impressionable young man, these causes offered something his comfortable life couldn't: purpose. Yet, even as Daniel began exploring activist circles in his teens, none could have predicted his eventual transformation. This wasn't a story of rebellion against privilege. Many of his peers supported similar causes without turning to violence. Something deeper was brewing in Daniel's psyche, a shift that would eventually turn the quiet tech enthusiast into one of America's most notorious domestic terrorists. His sailing skills, honed on the waters of San Francisco Bay, and his growing expertise in computer networks seemed like perfect preparations for a successful career. Instead, they would become tools for a life on the run, abilities that would help him evade capture for over 2 decades.
All the resources that are put to capturing those people, for somebody to be out there for 20 years and not found, means that they put a lot of effort to being not found.
The shift in Daniel San Diego's life didn't happen overnight. Like water gradually eroding stone, his transformation from privileged tech expert to domestic terrorist was subtle but relentless. By his early 20s, the sailing enthusiast, who once seemed destined for Silicon Valley success, had become deeply immersed in the animal rights movement. But while many activists chose peaceful protest, San Diego was drawn to a darker path. His first step seemed innocent enough. He adopted a vegan lifestyle, a common choice in the Bay Area's progressive circles. But for San Diego, veganism wasn't just about personal health or environmental consciousness. It became a political statement, an ideology that would eventually consume his entire worldview. He began attending animal rights protests, where his quiet intensity and technical knowledge made him stand out among the passionate crowds. As his involvement deepened, San Diego gravitated toward more extreme elements within the movement. The Animal Liberation Brigade, ALB, and similar groups offered what mainstream activism couldn't: direct action against those they deemed responsible for animal cruelty. These organizations, while not officially labeled as terrorist groups, were known for their aggressive tactics and property destruction. It only takes a spark. These words, tattooed across San Diego's chest alongside an image of burning buildings, became more than just body art. They were a manifesto, a glimpse into the mindset of a man who believed that revolutionary change required dramatic action. The pastoral scene, engulfed in flames, spoke volumes about his growing conviction that peaceful protest was insufficient. His technical background proved to be a double-edged sword. The same skills that could have launched a lucrative tech career now served a darker purpose. San Diego used his computer expertise to communicate securely with like-minded extremists, researching targets while staying under law enforcement's radar. His sailing abilities, once a hobby, became a potential means of international escape. By the early 2000s, San Diego's frustration with mainstream animal rights organizations had reached a breaking point. He began expressing views that even fellow activists found disturbing, suggesting that more aggressive measures were necessary to stop animal testing. His focus increasingly centered on companies like Huntington Life Sciences and their corporate partners, entities he saw not as businesses, but as perpetrators of systemic cruelty. Those who knew him during this period described a man consumed by his cause. Former associates recalled his mounting anger toward companies involved in animal testing, his growing conviction that traditional activism was failing to create meaningful change. But even they couldn't predict that his radicalization would soon explode into violence that would shock the Bay Area and launch one of the FBI's longest manhunts.
All we know that there were possibly plastic devices with egg timers as a part of the device.
August 28, 2003, dawned like any other day at the Chiron Corporation in Emeryville, California. Employees arrived for work at the sprawling biotech campus, unaware they were about to become targets in one of the most notorious domestic terrorism attacks in Bay Area history. At 3:47 a.m., the first explosion rocked the entrance of Chiron's headquarters. The blast shattered windows and twisted metal, sending debris across the normally pristine campus. But this was just the beginning. The bomber had planned something far more sinister. Approximately an hour later, a second device detonated in the parking lot, a calculated attempt to harm first responders who had arrived to investigate the initial explosion. The level of sophistication was alarming, recalled Sharif Ibrahim, a member of the UC Berkeley bomb squad at the time.
Anyone who uses a timing device for a bomb makes a sophisticated bomb.
The devices had plastic casings and egg timers. This wasn't amateur work. Whoever built these bombs knew exactly what they were doing. The attack sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Emeryville. Chiron, a major employer in the area, had been targeted for one reason: its business ties to Huntington Life Sciences, a research laboratory that conducted animal testing. But worse was yet to come. Less than a month later, on September 26th, the bomber struck again. This time, the target was Shackley Corporation in Pleasanton, another company with connections to Huntington. The device was even more dangerous than those used at Chiron, packed with nails to maximize casualties. Only luck prevented loss of life. Hours after each bombing, a group calling itself the Revolutionary Cells Animal Liberation Brigade, RCALB, claimed responsibility. Their message was chilling. These bombings are a warning. Sever your ties with Huntington Life Sciences or face the consequences. Former FBI spokesperson Andrew Black later reflected on the investigation's urgency.
This case was of great interest to the FBI. We had recently solved the Unabomb investigation, and bombings were of serious concern to the FBI in trying to solve them.
The sophistication of these devices, particularly the attempt to target first responders, made it clear we were dealing with a serious threat to public safety. The bombings marked a disturbing escalation in eco-terrorism. While groups like the Animal Liberation Front had a history of property destruction, these attacks showed a clear intent to harm or kill. The bomber had crossed a line that even many radical activists wouldn't dare approach.
It is a matter of time before someone is killed, and that's a very sobering thought.
As federal agents swarmed both bombing sites, they found evidence of meticulous planning. The devices showed technical expertise that suggested the bomber had either military training or significant research into explosives. The timing mechanisms, the strategic placement, the choice of targets, Everything pointed to a perpetrator who combined ideological fervor with dangerous technical skill.
Please remember, San Diego is considered armed and dangerous. If you have information concerning San Diego, please do not take independent action. We ask anyone with information on this individual or his location, contact your local FBI office or the nearest American embassy or consulate.
The business community was terrified. Companies with even tangential connections to animal testing began reinforcing security. Employees at research facilities started checking under their cars before starting them. The bomber had succeeded in one goal: creating an atmosphere of fear. The FBI's investigation into the bombings moved swiftly. Surveillance footage from Chiron provided their first breakthrough: grainy images of a man walking near the building shortly before the explosions. But it was what agents discovered about this suspect that left them stunned. The bomber wasn't some hardened criminal or experienced explosives expert. He was Daniel Andreas San Diego, a 25-year-old computer specialist from an affluent family. The profile didn't fit our typical bombing suspect, former FBI agent Gil Torres recalled. Here was this clean-cut guy from Marin County, someone who could have had a successful career in Silicon Valley. Instead, he was building bombs with kill switches and shrapnel. The evidence against San Diego mounted quickly. His technical background explained the sophisticated timing mechanisms in the bombs. His connections to animal rights groups aligned with the RCALB's claims of responsibility. But what truly caught investigators' attention was his meticulous nature. The same precision that made him a skilled computer expert had gone into planning these attacks. Agents began tracking San Diego's movements, watching as he drove through San Francisco's busy streets. On October 6, 2003, they thought they had him. They tailed him to Market Street, where he parked his car and walked toward a Bay Area rapid transit BART station. What happened next would haunt investigators for the next 2 decades. He knew exactly what he was doing, Andrew Black, former FBI spokesperson, later explained.
He parked his car, got out of his vehicle, and started walking down the street. And if I'm not mistaken, he went into a BART station, and that was the last time that we've seen him.
The escape was a masterclass in evasion. San Diego had likely planned his exit route carefully, using the sprawling BART system to his advantage. By the time agents realized he'd slipped away, he was long gone. This wasn't just luck. It was the result of careful planning by someone who understood both technology and human behavior. The FBI's frustration was palpable. They had been close, so close to capturing one of their most wanted suspects. Instead, they were left with a series of haunting questions. How had he known he was being watched? Where would he go? And most importantly, who was helping him? In cases like this, there's almost always a support network, Torres explained. Someone was helping him, providing money, safe houses, fake documents. These things don't happen in isolation. The investigation expanded rapidly. Agents interviewed known associates, monitored animal rights gatherings, and chased down every lead. But San Diego had vanished completely, leaving behind only speculation about how a domestic terrorist could simply disappear in an age of increasing surveillance and connectivity. In 2009, 6 years after the bombings, the FBI made an unprecedented move. Daniel Andreas San Diego became the first domestic terrorist added to their most wanted terrorists list, a roster previously reserved for international threats like Osama bin Laden.
Today we're announcing the addition of Daniel Andreas San Diego to the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. San Diego is wanted for his alleged involvement in the bombing of 2 biotechnology facilities in the San Francisco Bay Area. San Diego is the first domestic terrorist to be included on the most wanted terrorist list, a list that has historically been reserved for international terrorists indicted for various acts of terrorism against U.S. interest.
His face appeared on digital billboards in Times Square, and a $250,000 reward beckoned informants. Yet somehow, This high-profile fugitive continued to evade capture. It's not just about hiding, explained former FBI agent Gil Torres. It's about hiding smart. San Diego understood how to exploit gaps in international jurisdictions, how to move without leaving electronic fingerprints. He was playing a chess game with law enforcement, and for a long time, he was winning. Reports of sightings poured in from across the globe. One day, he was spotted in western Massachusetts, the next in Costa Rica. Tips placed him in Germany, Spain, France, even Hawaii. Each lead sent investigators scrambling, only to find their quarry had slipped away again.
He was actually in so many places. This literally was
Just hopping around.
Yeah,
right.
where in the world is
On the
Daniel
run,
San Diego? I mean, he was here apparently, allegedly. There were tips in Boston, Costa Rica, all over the world. So they finally caught up to him at this point.
His distinctive tattoos, particularly the burning pastoral scene with "It Only Takes a Spark," should have made him easy to identify. Instead, they became almost mythical markers of a man who seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere. San Diego's strict vegan lifestyle became both a signature and a survival tool. The FBI noted he would likely frequent specific types of stores and restaurants, but this dietary restriction also helped him blend into certain communities where alternative lifestyles were common. His sailing expertise raised concerns that he might be using maritime routes to cross borders undetected. He was disciplined, Andrew Black reflected. No credit cards, no phone calls to family, no social media. He understood that in our connected world, every digital interaction leaves a trace, so he simply went analog. Investigators believed San Diego received help from a network of sympathizers within the animal rights movement. Safe houses, false documents, and financial support didn't materialize from thin air. But proving these connections proved impossible. His supporters were as careful as he was. By the mid-2010s, the trail had grown cold. The FBI continued monitoring leads, but the immediacy of the hunt had faded. San Diego had achieved something remarkable in the modern era, near complete invisibility. His case became a textbook example of how determination, technical knowledge, and ideological support could help someone vanish, even in an age of unprecedented surveillance. Most fugitives make mistakes, Torres noted. They call home on Christmas, use a credit card during an emergency, or get sloppy with their false identity. San Diego didn't. His discipline was extraordinary. This discipline made him a ghost, living on the fringes of society, while the world's most sophisticated law enforcement agencies searched in vain. But even ghosts, as it turned out, leave footprints if you know where to look. After 21 years of shadows and speculation, Daniel Andreas San Diego's life as a fugitive ended in the most unlikely of places, a sleepy parish called Mainen in North Wales. The man who had outwitted the FBI for 2 decades was living in a white villa on the edge of dense woodlands, overlooking the picturesque Conwy Valley. His final hideout seemed almost poetically fitting, remote enough to avoid scrutiny, yet hiding in plain sight among the rolling Welsh hills. It's quite remote. You would never be able to find him, explained David Hughes, owner of the local Mainen Abbey Hotel. It's not even a village, it's a parish. There are only about 20 houses here. Nothing ever happens in Mainen until it did. Living under the alias Danny Webb, San Diego had crafted a carefully curated existence of solitude. Inside his rented house, the trappings of an ordinary life were evident. Men's clothes on a drying rack, a wetsuit hanging from the door, dishes left in the sink. But this carefully constructed normalcy was about to shatter. On November 25, 2024, the quiet of Mainen was broken by the sudden arrival of armed officers from the UK's National Crime Agency, NCA. The operation, coordinated with North Wales Police, moved with swift precision. San Diego, the man who had evaded capture for so long, was finally cornered. It was completely out of the blue, recalled one resident. Suddenly there were officers everywhere. In Mainen, we don't even lock our doors. Then one morning, we discovered we'd been living next to one of America's most wanted terrorists.
Personally, I thought he was Canadian because he was very quiet. Nothing against the Americans, but he wasn't very loud. He was very softly spoken. Yeah, he was a nice guy, but obviously not.
I've been in the pub. I've been to a pub with him. My husband has gone climbing with him. We've spent quite a lot of time with him over the last few months. So he was clearly socialising and enjoying the environment.
Despite his history of building bombs designed to kill, San Diego surrendered without resistance. The man who had once showcased such violent ideology now stood quietly as officers led him away. Inside his home, investigators found evidence of a life lived on the margins. Just enough possessions to exist, nothing to attract attention. Local residents, who had occasionally glimpsed their reclusive neighbor walking near the woods, were stunned to learn his true identity. He never went out much, one neighbor noted. His car was always parked on the drive. None of us had any idea. Even in the nearby town of Lanrust, just 3 miles away, news of the arrest was met with disbelief. "It's remote enough here that you could hide for years without anyone noticing," remarked a local pub patron. I guess he thought this was the perfect spot.
Well, it's a good place to hide, though, isn't it? Out in the countryside.
Well, I just wish I knew he was there so I could have had the reward money.
The FBI's reaction was one of measured triumph.
They were very close to capturing him then. He eluded them. They had a surveillance team on him, and he eluded them by parking the car near a BART station. That's a train station, hopping on it, never to be seen for 21 years.
After years of frustration, one of their most elusive fugitives was finally in custody. Christopher Wray, the FBI director, emphasized the significance. Daniel San Diego's arrest after more than 20 years demonstrates that the FBI's commitment to justice has no expiration date. The following day, San Diego appeared at Westminster Magistrates' Court in London, marking the beginning of extradition proceedings that would eventually return him to face charges in the United States. His calm demeanor in court reflected the same disciplined personality that had helped him evade capture for so long. The capture of Daniel Andrea San Diego represents more than just the end of a manhunt. It's a stark reminder of how a privileged life can spiral into extremism and how determination can help someone disappear, even in our hyper-connected world. His case challenges our understanding of both domestic terrorism and the limits of modern surveillance. This wasn't just about catching one man, reflected former FBI spokesperson Andrew Black. It was about sending a message to anyone who thinks they can evade justice indefinitely. San Diego's case shows that time doesn't weaken our resolve. It strengthens it. The implications of his capture rippled through multiple communities. For law enforcement, it highlighted both the challenges and possibilities of international cooperation. The successful collaboration between the FBI and UK authorities demonstrated how global partnerships could overcome the jurisdictional gaps that fugitives often exploit. For the animal rights movement, San Diego's case remains a complicated legacy. While mainstream activists have long distanced themselves from his violent methods, his 2-decade evasion made him something of a folk hero in more radical circles. His capture reignited debates about the line between passionate advocacy and criminal extremism. There's a right way and a wrong way to express your views, FBI Director Christopher Wray emphasized after the arrest.
It's the callous disregard for the community. It's okay to have a difference of opinion politically, but when you use or resort to violence and destruction of property and risk to human life, you're way out of bounds.
The technical sophistication of San Diego's bombs and his ability to evade detection for so long also raised troubling questions about the intersection of ideology and expertise. His case demonstrated how technical skills, when combined with extremist beliefs, could create particularly dangerous threats. Perhaps most significantly, his capture in a quiet Welsh village underscored an essential truth about fugitive life. No matter how carefully constructed, a false identity leaves cracks. Even San Diego, with his disciplined approach to evading detection, couldn't maintain perfect invisibility forever. As he awaits extradition in a London prison, the full impact of his story continues to unfold. His case will likely influence how law enforcement approaches similar investigations in the future, particularly in an era where digital surveillance meets increasingly sophisticated evasion techniques. 21 years, 2 continents, countless false leads. The story of Daniel Andreas San Diego reads like a Hollywood thriller, but the reality is far more chilling. A brilliant mind twisted by extremism, technical skills turned to terrorism, and a game of cat and mouse that spanned decades. His capture in that quiet Welsh village doesn't just close a chapter in FBI history. It raises questions that we as a society must grapple with. How does someone with every advantage in life choose a path of violence? What drives a person to abandon everything they know to live as a ghost? And perhaps most troubling, how many others like San Diego are out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment? As San Diego faces justice in an American courtroom, his case reminds us that no matter how far someone runs, how carefully they hide, or how long they evade capture, the long arm of the law often finds a way. From the streets of Berkeley to a remote Welsh parish, his journey shows that even the most meticulous plans can unravel.
As soon as her friend came out of the restaurant, him and the other friend, they went to look for her, and she was gone, nowhere to be found.
Trust is a fragile thing, especially in small towns. It's the invisible thread that binds communities together, creating a sense of safety, of knowing your neighbors, of believing that the darkness of the world stops at your town's borders. But what happens when that thread snaps? When the unthinkable creeps in, turning peaceful riverbanks into crime scenes and friendly faces into suspects? In the summer of 1988, the quiet town of Sumner, Washington, learned just how quickly that sense of security could shatter. A young woman's body, stripped of both clothing and dignity, drifted in the murky waters where the Puyallup and White Rivers meet. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. But for 2 haunting months, she would remain nameless, her identity as mysterious as the circumstances of her death. This is the story of Tracy Whitney, an 18-year-old whose dreams were violently stolen one August night. It's a tale of a killer who walked free for decades, of a family's relentless pursuit of answers, and of how modern science finally unveiled secrets that the river had kept hidden for 34 years. But most of all, it's a reminder that in small towns where everyone knows everyone, the most dangerous person might be the stranger you never noticed at all. On August 28, 1988, the serene waters of the Puyallup River held a grim secret. 2 fishermen, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful Sunday morning, became unwitting witnesses to a tragedy. Where the Puyallup and White Rivers converge, they spotted something that would haunt them forever. The nude body of a young woman floating face down in the murky waters. The discovery sent shockwaves through Pierce County. Sheriff's deputies rushed to secure the scene, their patrol cars shattering the Sunday morning quiet. The peaceful riverbank transformed into a hub of investigative activity. Yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the summer breeze. The victim showed clear signs of violence, her body bearing witness to her final moments. The complete absence of clothing or personal effects made it clear this was no accident. Someone had taken great care to strip away anything that might identify her, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. News of the discovery spread like wildfire through Sumner and its neighboring communities. In these small towns, where violent crime was rare, such incidents hit particularly hard. Parents kept their children closer, and neighbors eyed strangers with newfound suspicion. The community's sense of security once taken for granted, now seemed as fragile as morning frost. Local media swarmed the scene, their evening broadcasts fueling speculation. Was this an isolated incident? Could there be more victims? And perhaps most terrifying, was the killer still among them? For detectives, these early hours were crucial. They meticulously documented every detail, searching for anything that might identify their Jane Doe. But the river had kept its secrets well. Her family remained unaware of her fate, not knowing their loved one lay in the county morgue.
Who was Tracy? Where does she go? What does she do? Who does she hang out with? Who would possibly hurt her?
Before she became a headline in one of Washington's most haunting cold cases, Tracy Jean Whitney was just a young woman standing on the threshold of adulthood. Born in 1970, she grew up in Washington State, the eldest daughter in a close-knit family. At 18, she was just beginning to write her own story, unaware that someone else would tragically pen its final chapter. Those who knew Tracy remember a quiet strength about her. She wasn't the type to command attention, but her presence had a way of making others feel at ease. Her sister Robin, just 11 when Tracy died, cherishes precious memories of an extraordinary big sister. In every birthday photo from my childhood, Robin would later recall, Tracy stands behind me, this protective presence, her face glowing with pride. She was the kind of sister who made even ordinary moments feel special.
She's 7 years older than me. I don't remember a lot.
Tracy was quiet, never really ever caused a problem. She had your normal childhood, good kid.
Friends remember Tracy defying typical teenage stereotypes. Sweet and loyal were words often used to describe her, someone who would go out of her way to help others without expecting anything in return. Having recently graduated high school, she was navigating that delicate space between childhood and independence with remarkable grace. Tracy's last summer was filled with moments that seem ordinary until they become precious memories. She helped neighborhood kids with lemonade stands, spent evenings with friends, and made plans for her future. Her mother remembers Tracy's infectious laugh, how it could light up a room. She was good, her mother would later say, voice thick with emotion. Just genuinely good. The last clear memory Robin has of her sister is from her own 11th birthday party, weeks before Tracy's disappearance.
When I was 11, she came over for my birthday party. This is how I last remember her. There's a twinkle in her eyes. She looked happy. I remember being upset because I hadn't seen her in a while and only truly beginning to know who she was.
That birthday would become more than just a celebration. It would be the last time Robin would see her sister alive. Tracy's story could have been one of triumph, of a young woman coming into her own. She could have been the sister who watched Robin grow up, the daughter who made her parents proud, the friend who kept in touch over the years. Instead, her story became a reminder that even in the safest communities, darkness can find its way in.
I was devastated, felt like my world had ended. It was just the worst moment of my life.
August 27th, 1988, began as just another summer Saturday in Federal Way, Washington. The kind of day that should have melted into countless others in memory. Instead, it would become the day that changed everything for the Whitney family. It was the last day anyone would see Tracy alive. The evening started innocently enough. Tracy had gone to a local Burger King with friends, a typical weekend hangout spot for local teenagers. The restaurant, with its familiar fluorescent lights and plastic booths, was packed with the usual weekend crowd. But what began as a casual night out would soon take a dark turn that no one could have predicted. Witnesses later described a tense scene unfolding at the restaurant. Tracy became involved in an argument with her ex-boyfriend, the details of which would later become crucial to investigators. The quarrel escalated emotions running high. Those who saw Tracy that night remember her being visibly upset, tears in her eyes. Then, in a moment that would haunt everyone present, she walked out of the restaurant and into the warm August night. Her friends, concerned about her emotional state, immediately went looking for her. They searched the parking lot, calling her name. They checked nearby streets and familiar hangouts. But Tracy had vanished into the darkness. At first, they hoped she had just gone home to cool off. A reasonable assumption given the circumstances. No one imagined they were witnessing the beginning of a nightmare. Hours ticked by with no word from Tracy. For a responsible young woman who always kept in touch with family and friends, this silence was deafening. Her mother, initially trying to stay calm, began making increasingly worried phone calls. Each unanswered ring amplified the growing sense of dread. This wasn't like Tracy. She wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone. By the next morning, panic had set in. Tracy hadn't come home. She hadn't called. She hadn't reached out to any friends. Her bed remained untouched, her personal belongings exactly where she'd left them. Her family contacted the police. But in 1988, missing person cases, especially involving teenagers, often weren't treated with immediate urgency. There was a tendency to assume young people had simply run away, would cool off, would come home on their own. But Tracy's family knew better. They knew their daughter, their sister. This wasn't a rebellious teenager running away from home. This was something far more sinister. As Sunday dawned, they couldn't know that just miles away, fishermen were about to make a discovery that would confirm their worst fears. The time between Tracy leaving the Burger King and the discovery of her body would later become the focus of an intense investigation. What happened in those crucial hours? Who did she encounter? How did she end up in the river? These questions would haunt investigators and family alike for decades to come. Less than 24 hours after walking out of that Burger King, Tracy's life ended violently. While her family searched frantically and friends waited for her call, she was already gone, her body drifting in the dark waters of the Puyallup River. At the Pierce County Medical Examiner's office, her story was written only in bruises and trauma.
In this particular case, there were a lot of blunt force injuries on her. The medical examiner actually ruled it as a homicide due to the fact she had died of asphyxiation caused by strangulation with probable smothering as well.
The autopsy painted a horrific picture: death by asphyxia, a violent struggle marked by multiple injuries, and evidence of sexual assault. The killer had methodically stripped away all identification, but left behind crucial DNA that would prove fatal. Decades later, for 2 haunting months, she remained nameless, while detectives worked through missing persons reports, and the community held its breath. Parents kept their children closer. Young women traveled in groups. Everyone wondered, was there a predator among them? October 1988. Finally gave her back her name through dental records. The revelation stunned the community. Tracy wasn't just another statistic, she was one of their own. The investigation exploded into high gear with her ex-boyfriend as an immediate focus, but his alibi proved solid, and other suspects were gradually cleared. What baffled investigators most was the attack's random nature. With no cell phones or security cameras, crucial timeline gaps proved impossible to fill. Their killer had managed to abduct, assault, and murder Tracy without leaving a single witness, suggesting either incredible luck or chilling experience. The trail cooled, but detectives preserved the DNA evidence, though testing in 1988 was primitive. That evidence would wait decades in storage, a silent witness holding secrets that technology wasn't yet ready to reveal. Tracy's family endured each day like a fresh wound, while her case joined Pierce County's growing stack of unsolved homicides. Yet the detectives never forgot. The brutality, Tracy's youth, the randomness, it all suggested a predator who might strike again. They knew he was out there, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. And someday, somehow, the evidence they'd preserved would finally speak Tracy's truth.
I don't think the grief will ever go away. It'll never go away. It's the first thing I think about when I get up in the morning, last thing I think about at night. I felt like somebody had reached down my throat and pulled my heart out.
Time should heal all wounds, but for those connected to Tracy Whitney's case, the years only deepened the scars. As the 1990s dawned and her file joined Pierce County's growing stack of cold cases, the pain remained razor sharp, especially for her sister Robin. Every milestone was like losing her all over again, Robin would later recall, her voice catching. Birthdays, Christmases, graduations, there was always an empty chair where Tracy should have been. Their mother kept a box of Tracy's belongings untouched, a time capsule of a life frozen at 18. Years passed, but their hope for justice never wavered, even as leads grew colder and witnesses' memories faded. The case wasn't completely dormant. Periodically, detectives would dust off Tracy's file, poring over evidence they'd memorized years ago, hoping fresh eyes might catch something they'd missed. But their killer had been careful, methodical, leaving behind only DNA evidence that 1990s technology couldn't unlock. Each renewed investigation ended in familiar frustration. 2005 brought what seemed like a breakthrough. Tracy's DNA evidence was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's revolutionary database linking crime scenes to offenders nationwide. Her family dared to hope again.
I said, this is it. This is it. This is the break that we've been waiting for.
But month after month, year after year, no matches appeared. Their killer remained a ghost, his DNA uncatalogued in any system. Behind the scenes, forensic science raced forward. What had been impossible in 1988 became routine by the 2000s. DNA testing grew more sophisticated, requiring mere traces to yield results that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier.
I knew that with the new technology in DNA research, it was a good chance that we could get this solved. So that kind of gave me a hope.
The original investigators' dedication in preserving evidence at a time when many departments routinely destroyed old samples would prove crucial. Robin refused to let her sister's case fade into obscurity. She became Tracy's tireless advocate, building relationships with detectives, attending cold case conferences, keeping the story alive in local media. I promised myself people wouldn't forget her, Robin said. Someone knew something. We just had to find them. Then in 2018, genetic genealogy exploded into public consciousness with the arrest of the Golden State Killer. Suddenly, cases that had seemed forever unsolvable had new hope. For Tracy's family, watching that case unfold felt like standing on the edge of a breakthrough. After 3 decades of dead ends, could this new science finally put a name to their nightmare? As 2021 approached, they had no way of knowing that Tracy's case was about to break wide open. But the answer, when it finally came, would prove more bittersweet than anyone could have imagined. Tracy Whitney's case still haunted retired Detective Sergeant Linnell Anderson. After countless investigations across her career, this one refused to let go. The carefully preserved DNA evidence from 1988 held secrets, waiting for science to catch up to their killer's identity. Anderson's determination drove her to secure a grant from the Washington State Attorney General's office for cutting-edge DNA testing. Her goal was audacious but simple: unmask the predator who had eluded justice for over 3 decades. The approval felt like the first ray of hope in years.
And finally, she called me up one day and she said, Ron, I'm going to come up. Got the ID on the murder. But I want to tell you something right now. There's not going to be an arrest.
Enter Parabon Labs, pioneers in genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique that had finally unmasked the Golden State Killer. This wasn't standard DNA testing. It was genetic detective work on an unprecedented scale. In March 2022, Tracy's preserved evidence arrived at their lab, carrying with it the weight of 34 years of unanswered questions. The process was like building a massive puzzle without having the picture. Genetic genealogists worked backward through time, constructing intricate family trees stretching back centuries. Each DNA match was a potential pathway to their killer, each branch of the family tree a possible route to justice. One wrong turn could derail years of work. Then, in August 2022, a name emerged from the genetic maze, John Guillot Jr. But the breakthrough came with a devastating twist. Guillot had died from cancer in January 2022, just months before his identification. Even more frustrating, his body had been cremated, seemingly taking with it any chance of final confirmation. But Detective Anderson refused to let her quarry slip away one last time. Learning that Guillot's recently deceased son's remains were at the medical examiner's office, she saw one last chance. The DNA comparison was conclusive. The son's genetic profile proved that his father was the man who had left his DNA on Tracy's body. The evidence was undeniable. Their killer had been living in Puyallup all along, just miles from where he had disposed of Tracy's body. For 34 years, Guillot had walked freely among them, probably driving past the very spots where detectives had searched for clues, carrying his dark secret until cancer, not justice, finally claimed him. For Anderson and her team, the identification brought a complex mix of triumph and regret. They had finally solved one of their most haunting cold cases, but Guillot would never face a jury, never have to confront Tracy's family, never have to answer for his crimes. Science had revealed his identity, but death had granted him one final escape. As investigators dug into John Guillot Jr.'s past, a disturbing portrait emerged that chilled them to the bone. This wasn't some drifting predator who had struck and vanished. He was their neighbor. A longtime resident of Puyallup, Guillot had lived for decades, just miles from where he'd disposed of Tracy's body, blending seamlessly into the fabric of small-town life. At 65, Guillot had mastered the art of invisibility through ordinariness. He was the kind of man who could live next door for years without drawing a second glance. But beneath this unremarkable exterior lurked something monstrous, and investigators soon discovered Tracy might not have been his only victim. Two other deaths now cast long shadows over Guillot's past. In 2010, his girlfriend died under suspicious circumstances. A decade later, in 2020, his wife's death drew similar scrutiny. In both cases, Guillot had been questioned but never charged. The evidence too circumstantial. His explanations just plausible enough. But now these cases took on a darker meaning. This wasn't just about Tracy anymore, Detective Anderson revealed, her voice tight with contained fury. We had to wonder how many others there might have been. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 decades of suspicious deaths, all connected to one man who had perfected the art of escaping justice. Tracy's murder now appeared to be the work of an experienced predator. Unlike many homicide cases where victim and killer share some connection, Guillot had chosen her opportunistically. Young, vulnerable, alone, she had been the perfect target for a hunter who likely had years of practice both before and after that fatal night in 1988. The most haunting aspect wasn't just what Guillot had done, but how close he'd stayed to his crime. For years, he had lived and worked in the area while detectives searched for Tracy's killer. He had probably read about her death in the papers, watched the news coverage, perhaps even joined conversations about the case that had shocked their community. Like a spider in its web, he had watched and waited, secure in his anonymity. When cancer claimed Guillot in January 2022, he nearly took his secrets to the grave. Only the preservation of DNA evidence and the advent of genetic genealogy prevented his final escape, but his death left crucial questions forever unanswered. How many other victims were there? What drove him to kill? How had he maintained his facade of normalcy for so long? The identification of John Guillot Jr. brought an end to decades of uncertainty. But for the Whitney family, the resolution felt hollow. In my head, I always thought we'd be sitting in a courtroom, Robin shared, her voice trembling. Instead, we just have a name.
Killer of a 17-year-old girl.
Her body found in a snowpack off Highway 243 near Banning after she had been raped and bludgeoned to death. After the Riverside County Sheriff's Department received an anonymous tip from a caller.
Imagine calling the police to report finding a body. Now imagine that same body was someone you killed. It sounds like something out of a twisted crime novel, but that's exactly what happened in Beaumont, California in 1979. A killer so confident in his ability to evade capture that he literally led police to his own crime scene and then watched them fail to catch him for 45 years. The morning was bitterly cold, snow blanketing the ground along Highway 243 when the anonymous call came in. The caller's voice was steady, almost eerily calm, as he directed law enforcement to what he claimed was a chance discovery. But this was no random find. This was a calculated move by a killer who had just committed what he thought was the perfect crime. What investigators would discover that morning would shake the small town of Beaumont to its core. The body of 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez, brutally raped and beaten, partially buried in the snow. But the most chilling part of this story isn't just the murder itself. It's how the killer hid in plain sight for nearly half a century, protected by a failed polygraph test and the limitations of 1970s forensic science. This isn't just another cold case. This is the story of how a murderer's arrogance led him to report his own crime, counting on the fact that nobody would suspect the helpful citizen who called it in. It's a tale of justice delayed, but not denied, where modern science would finally unravel a killer's decades-old confidence game. This is the story of Esther Gonzalez and the 45-year journey to uncover a truth that was hiding in plain sight all along.
It seemed like, with Randy and stuff, they should have brought him in at least to talk to him. I mean, I know he passed his test or whatever, but I don't know. It just seemed like they could have done something more about it.
Beaumont, California, 1979 was a different world. Nestled between mountains and desert, this small town of tightly knit communities was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where teenagers could walk home after dark without fear, and where violent crime was something that happened in big cities, not in their own backyard. It was here that Esther Gonzalez spent her 17 years, the cherished youngest child of a large, loving family. Being the baby of the family had shaped her entire personality. She was the one who could make everyone smile, the peacemaker, the dreamer. Her sister Elizabeth would later recall how Esther had a way of lighting up any room she entered. Her warm smile and gentle nature making her impossible not to love.
She was really sweet. She wouldn't hurt anybody.
In early 1979, Esther was living the typical life of a high school senior at Beaumont High. Her days were filled with classes, friends, and dreams of the future that stretched endlessly before her. In just a few months, she would graduate, joining the class of 79 in their caps and gowns, ready to embrace whatever opportunities life had in store. She had that mixture of innocence and hope that defines so many 17-year-olds, old enough to glimpse the adult world ahead, but young enough to still believe in the inherent goodness of people. But like any teenager, Esther's life wasn't without its struggles. The natural tensions between a young woman seeking independence and parents trying to protect their youngest child occasionally bubbled to the surface. These arguments were normal, healthy even, part of growing up. No one could have known that one such disagreement would set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. On February 9th, 1979, Esther had an argument with her father, the kind that happens in households across America every day. The subject of their disagreement has been lost to time, likely seeming inconsequential even then. But its aftermath would haunt her family forever. Frustrated and wanting space, Esther decided to walk to her sister's house in nearby Banning, a journey she had made countless times before. Her sister Elizabeth, sensing the tension, offered to give her a ride later that evening. It was a simple gesture of kindness, the type of offer siblings make every day without thinking. But Esther, perhaps still caught in the aftermath of the argument, declined.
She got upset with my dad. I don't know what he's told her, but she got upset, took off walking.
She wanted to walk, to clear her head in the cool winter air. It was a decision that would cost her her life, and one that would haunt Elizabeth for decades to come. None of them knew it then, but this ordinary teenage moment, an argument, a declined ride, a familiar walk, would be the last chapter of Esther's story.
I tell myself, why didn't we follow her? Because she just wanted to ride to her boyfriend.
February nights in Beaumont can be unforgiving. The temperature drops sharply after sunset, and in 1979, the winter had been particularly harsh. On that February 9th evening, as Esther set out on her walk to Banning, the mountain air was already turning bitter cold. The same route she had walked so many times before suddenly seemed different in the gathering darkness. What happened to Esther between leaving her house and the discovery of her body remains largely unknown. The walk to her sister's house should have taken less than an hour, but somewhere along that familiar path, she encountered pure evil. Investigators would later piece together that she had been attacked, sexually assaulted, and brutally beaten to death. Her final moments must have been filled with unimaginable terror. The next morning painted a grim picture. Snow had fallen overnight, nature's attempt to cover up the horror that had taken place. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the Riverside County Sheriff's Department received a call that would kickstart one of their longest-running investigations. The caller's voice was unnaturally calm as he reported finding a body along Highway 243. The response was immediate. When deputies arrived at the scene, they found themselves on a remote stretch of Highway 243, a winding mountain road that cuts through some of Southern California's most isolated terrain. There, partially buried in the fresh snow, lay the body of a young woman. It didn't take long to identify her as Esther Gonzalez. The crime scene told a story of savage violence. Esther had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned with such force that the medical examiner would later struggle to document all her injuries. The killer had shown no mercy, no humanity. After the attack, he had left her there in the snow, discarded like trash along the highway. The peaceful mountain road, usually known for its scenic beauty, had become the site of unthinkable brutality. The location itself raised questions. Highway 243 wasn't on Esther's regular route to her sister's house. How did she end up there? Was she forced into a vehicle? Did she accept a ride from someone she knew? These questions would haunt investigators for decades. As word of the discovery spread, the tight-knit community of Beaumont was shaken to its core. Parents kept their children indoors, neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion, and the carefree atmosphere that had defined this small town evaporated overnight. The brutal reality of what had happened to one of their own destroyed any illusion of safety they had maintained. The snow that had blanketed Esther's body had also complicated the crime scene investigation. While it had preserved some evidence, it had also obscured potentially crucial clues. Nevertheless, investigators meticulously collected what they could, including biological evidence that would prove crucial decades later. At the time, though, they had no way of knowing just how important these samples would become, or that the killer himself had already inserted himself into the investigation. What no one realized then was that the anonymous caller, the man who had led police to Esther's body, wasn't just a random Good Samaritan. He was the killer himself, hiding behind an act of civic duty that would protect him for nearly half a century. It was a calculated move that demonstrated not just cunning, but an almost unthinkable level of cold-blooded confidence. In the immediate aftermath of discovering Esther's body, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department launched what they believed would be a straightforward investigation. After all, they had something most departments dream of, someone who could lead them directly to the crime scene. What they didn't realize was that this apparent stroke of luck was actually part of the killer's calculated plan. The anonymous caller was quickly identified as Louis Randolph Randy Williamson. In an era before caller ID and cell phone tracking, Williamson had been surprisingly willing to come forward and identify himself as the tipster. He appeared cooperative, concerned, and exactly what you'd expect from a good citizen who had stumbled upon something horrible. When detectives interviewed Williamson, they found themselves face to face with a man who seemed genuinely helpful. His story was simple. He had been driving along Highway 243 that morning when he spotted something unusual in the snow. Upon closer inspection, he discovered it was a body and immediately called the police. His demeanor was calm, his answers consistent, his behavior exactly what you might expect from an innocent person who had made a gruesome discovery. "I just knew I had to report it," he told investigators, his voice steady and sure. "I couldn't just leave her there in the snow." The performance was masterful, just the right mix of civic duty and controlled emotion. Not once did he slip up or show the kind of anxiety you might expect from a killer being questioned about his own crime. In what would later prove to be a critical mistake, investigators suggested Williamson take a polygraph test. It was standard procedure in 1979, a time when lie detector tests were considered nearly infallible. Williamson agreed without hesitation. Another calculated move that would help cement his appearance of innocence. To everyone's surprise, he passed the polygraph. This single test result would prove to be a devastating misdirection. With their prime suspect seemingly cleared by science, investigators were forced to look elsewhere. It was a crucial error that would protect Williamson for decades to come. Meanwhile, the physical evidence collected from the scene painted a horrific picture of Esther's final moments. The medical examiner confirmed she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Semen samples were collected, evidence that would eventually crack the case wide open. But in 1979, DNA testing was still years away from becoming a reliable forensic tool. These crucial samples were carefully preserved, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. As weeks turned into months, traditional detective work yielded few results. Interviews with Esther's friends and family revealed no obvious suspects. The community, though horrified by the crime, could offer no meaningful leads. The case began to grow cold, even as Williamson continued his life in plain sight, probably marveling at how easily he had fooled everyone. The investigation's focus shifted multiple times. Other potential suspects were interviewed and cleared. Theories were developed and discarded. All the while, the real killer had been the first person they'd spoken to, the helpful citizen who had reported finding the body, who had passed their lie detector test, who had played his part so perfectly that no one thought to look deeper. By the end of 1979, the case had effectively stalled. The initial investigation files were filled with dead ends, failed leads, and one crucial oversight. They had already interviewed the killer and let him walk away. Time, however, doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just makes them deeper. For the Gonzalez family, each passing year without answers was another layer of pain added to their tragedy. The calendar became a cruel reminder. Birthdays Esther would never celebrate, graduations she would never attend, a future she would never see. Her father carried the heaviest burden. That final argument with Esther, so normal, so ordinary at the time, had become a weight he couldn't shed. "If only I hadn't argued with her," he would say in quiet moments. "If only I had gone looking for her that night." The if-onlys became a litany of regret that echoed through the decades. Elizabeth, the sister who had offered that fateful ride, found herself trapped in her own cycle of guilt. I should have insisted, she would later tell investigators. I should have followed her, picked her up anyway. Her loving gesture of offering a ride, rejected in a moment of teenage stubbornness, had become a ghost that haunted her dreams.
I tell myself, why didn't we follow her, you know?
The 1980s rolled into the 1990s. Beaumont changed. The small town grew larger. Newer families moved in, and younger residents had no memory of the tragedy that had once shaken their community. But for those who remembered, the unsolved murder of Esther Gonzalez remained an open wound, a reminder that a killer still walked among them. The case files gathered dust, but they were never truly forgotten. Different investigators over the years would pull them out, hoping fresh eyes might spot something missed. Each time the case was reopened, the Gonzalez family's hopes would rise, only to be dashed again when no new leads materialized. It was an emotional roller coaster that seemed endless. Meanwhile, forensic science was evolving. The development of DNA testing in the late 1980s revolutionized criminal investigations. Cold cases across the country were being solved through this new technology. Yet Esther's case remained stubbornly closed. The evidence collected in 1979 sat in storage, waiting for its moment. Throughout these years, Louis Randolph Williamson continued living his life in plain sight. Did he think about Esther? Did he feel secure in his deception, protected by that past polygraph test from 1979? Did he ever cross paths with her family in the small town, carrying his dark secret while they grieved? These questions would only be answered decades later. The most painful part of these lost years was watching other cases get solved while Esther's remained open. Each time another cold case made headlines, thanks to DNA evidence or a confession, the Gonzalez family wondered, why not Esther's case? Why not their closure? They didn't know that the evidence that would eventually crack the case was already in police possession, preserved from that snowy morning in 1979. As the new millennium arrived, a new generation of investigators began to take interest in cold cases. Advanced forensic techniques were making the impossible possible. The preserved evidence from Esther's case, including those crucial biological samples, suddenly held new potential. But technology alone wasn't enough. It would take a dedicated team of cold case investigators to finally put all the pieces together. By 2014, when Williamson died of natural causes, no one suspected his connection to the case. He took his secret to the grave, probably believing he had committed the perfect crime. In a twist of fate, a routine blood sample taken during his autopsy would later become the key to unraveling his decades of deception. These were the lost years, years of pain, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, but they were also years of advancing science, preserving evidence, and laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a breakthrough in one of California's most puzzling cold cases. 2023 marked a watershed moment in forensic science. What was impossible in 1979 had become routine, and cases once considered unsolvable were being cracked open across the country. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team had seen enough of these breakthroughs to know that no case was truly hopeless, not even one as old as Esther's. When they reopened Esther's case file, they found themselves looking at evidence that had been waiting patiently for over 4 decades. The semen samples collected from that snowy morning in 1979 had been meticulously preserved, like a message in a bottle waiting to be discovered. But this time, they had something their predecessors didn't: the power of forensic genealogy. Enter Othram, a cutting-edge forensic laboratory in Texas that had been making waves in the true crime community. Unlike traditional DNA labs, Othram specialized in cases others considered impossible: degraded evidence, tiny samples, decades-old specimens. They had developed proprietary techniques that could extract DNA profiles from evidence that other labs might have dismissed as hopeless. The process was painstaking. First, the lab had to determine if they could even get usable DNA from the 45-year-old samples. It was like trying to read a book that had been left out in the rain for decades. The information was there, but accessing it required extraordinary care and cutting-edge technology. These old samples are always a challenge, one Othram scientist would later explain. But sometimes, the older the case, the better preserved the evidence, because it was collected in an era when investigators gathered everything, not knowing what might eventually be useful. Using advanced extraction techniques and next-generation sequencing, the team began building a DNA profile from the preserved evidence. It was a process that would have seemed like science fiction to the original investigators in 1979. Piece by piece, the genetic puzzle came together. Once they had a workable DNA profile, the real detective work began. Forensic genealogists began the meticulous process of building family trees, searching through public databases and tracking down distant relatives who might share genetic markers with their unknown suspect. It was like trying to find a specific drop of water in a river, tracing it back to its source. Then came the moment that changed everything. The DNA profile led them to a familiar name, Lewis Randolph Williamson, the same man who had called in the anonymous tip, the same man who had passed the polygraph test, the same man who had been hiding in plain sight for 45 years. But there was a catch. Williamson had died in 2014, seemingly taking his secrets to the grave. Had they hit another dead end? Not quite. During routine autopsy procedures, a vial of Williamson's blood had been preserved. This final piece of evidence would prove crucial.
Once we started looking into Randy further, we determined that that he passed away in 2014, and that when he passed away, during his autopsy they had collected a vial of blood.
When investigators compared the DNA from Williamson's preserved blood sample to the evidence collected from Esther's body, they found an exact match. The science was irrefutable. The mystery caller who had led police to Esther's body hadn't just discovered her by chance. He was her killer. Williamson hadn't just committed murder. He had orchestrated one of the most audacious cover-ups imaginable. While other killers ran from their crimes, he had walked straight into the investigation, using his anonymous call not as an act of conscience, but as his insurance policy. His performance had been masterful. The detective's notes from 1979 revealed a man so convincing, so seemingly genuine, that even a polygraph test couldn't detect his deception. Every move was calculated. From choosing Highway 243, far from Esther's normal route, to his composed demeanor during questioning. He had selected the perfect spot to commit his crime, and later discover the body without raising suspicion. The timing of his death in 2014 meant Williamson had escaped earthly justice, living 35 years as a free man while the Gonzalez family suffered. Elizabeth, Esther's sister, captured the family's mixed emotions. Part of me is relieved to finally know, but another part is angry that he took this secret to his grave.
We feel closure. I mean, I know he died, but, he's got to face God, so that's what I'd be afraid of.
I'm just glad that we finally found out who it was.
The revelation sent shockwaves through Beaumont. Residents who had interacted with Williamson over the decades struggled to reconcile the helpful citizen they knew with the monster he truly was. But while many questions died with him, his case proved something crucial. There is no such thing as a perfect crime. As we close this tragic chapter, we're left wondering how many other killers have hidden behind masks of civic duty. How many families are still waiting for answers locked away in preserved DNA evidence? Williamson might have died thinking he had committed the perfect crime, but justice had its own timeline. DNA doesn't forget, and secrets don't stay buried forever.
Why would they kill her? I don't care what happens to people. I really don't, because they have to live with it, but I want to know why they killed my daughter.
The call came in at 4:21 p.m. When police arrived at the Lincoln Village apartment complex in Columbus, Ohio. They found a scene that would haunt them for decades. Inside, lying on the hardwood floor, was the body of 20-year-old Amy Hooper. She was naked, her hands bound behind her with a distinctive necklace, her skull cracked open, and her body riddled with stab wounds. But it wasn't just the brutality of the crime that disturbed investigators. It was the eerie precision of it all. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. For 32 years, 9 months, and 8 days, her killer walked free. The case went cold, but it never went away. Detectives who worked the case would see her face every day, walking into work, a constant reminder of justice delayed. Her father died in 2009, never knowing who took his daughter's life, carrying that burden of uncertainty to his grave. But on December 5th, 2023, everything changed. A discarded item, a DNA test, and suddenly, the shadows that had hidden Amy's killer for over 3 decades began to recede. The question was no longer who killed Amy Hooper, but why? What drove someone to commit such a savage act against a young woman known for her kindness, who had recently helped a homeless mother and child by giving them a place to stay? The answer would reveal a twisted tale of obsession, betrayal, and a killer who thought they had gotten away with murder. This is the story of how a decades-old cold case was finally cracked and how justice, though delayed, was not denied. But first, we need to go back to where it all began to understand who Amy Hooper was and why someone would want her dead.
Never a day goes by where I don't think about it. Every day, just think about it.
Amy Joy Hooper was born on November 2nd, 1971, the youngest of 3 daughters. From the start, she was doted on by her older sisters, Holly and Sandy, who treated her like their own little doll. But growing up in Columbus, Ohio, Amy's path wouldn't be as smooth as her early years might have suggested. By her teenage years, the first signs of trouble appeared. Amy began dating a boy her parents disapproved of, and with good reason. He turned out to be abusive, hitting her on 2 separate occasions. The situation grew worse when the boy's mother, who worked in the school cafeteria, began harassing Amy after she tried to break things off. It was Amy's first brush with the kind of obsessive behavior that would later play a deadly role in her life. Concerned for their daughter's safety, Amy's parents gave her a choice. She could either live with her aunt or move to California with her sister Sandy. Amy chose California, a decision that might have saved her life at the time. She spent her junior year of high school there, forming an even closer bond with her sister. But after graduation in 1989, the pull of home brought her back to Columbus. Back in Ohio, Amy moved in with her mother, who was going through a divorce from Amy's father. Despite the family turmoil, Amy had dreams. She wanted to work in fashion and eventually return to California for college. Taking a job as a manager at Wilson's Leather in Westland Mall, she began saving money for her future. She was responsible, never missing a day of work, never showing up late. She even occasionally designed display windows for the Lazarus department store. By early 1992, Amy was ready for independence. On February 17th, she rented her own apartment at 4942 Medfield Way in Lincoln Village. The ground floor apartment opened directly onto a grassy area with walkways leading between various buildings. There were no security gates, no cameras, just a simple door separating Amy from the outside world. In a move that spoke volumes about her character, Amy invited a homeless woman and her child to live with her rent-free. She didn't know the woman well, but Amy had a soft spot for anyone in need. Her mother had initially objected when Amy tried to move them into her house, but Amy was determined to help. This generosity, this willingness to trust, was both her greatest strength and potentially her greatest vulnerability. At just 20 years old and barely 5'3", Amy was described by her family as 90 pounds soaking wet. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination. She was known for dating who she wanted, despite what others might think, and standing her ground when necessary. She loved animals, taking in 2 cats, and had a wide circle of friends. To the outside world, she seemed to be thriving, a young woman building her own life, step by step. But beneath this seemingly normal surface, dark currents were stirring. In the weeks before her death, Amy had confided in her sister Sandy about a man who wouldn't leave her alone. She'd also recently shared concerns with her mother about suspicious activities at work. These seemingly unrelated threads would soon weave together into a deadly pattern, one that would end with Amy's brutal murder. Monday, March 9th, 1992, began like any other day. Amy had just returned from spending the weekend visiting a boyfriend in Bowling Green, a detail she'd kept from her mother. That morning at 6:30 a.m., she arrived at her mother's house in Grove City to return a borrowed car. As her mother, Joy, got ready for work, the two chatted casually. Amy mentioned she had a manager's meeting at work later that day. She seemed happy, normal. There was no indication that these would be their final moments together. After leaving her mother's house with her sister Holly's car, Amy presumably drove straight to her apartment. What happened next would become the subject of intense investigation. Police believe Amy took a shower upon returning home, a detail that would later help narrow down their timeline. Her makeup and hairbrushes were found laid out, suggesting she was preparing for work. Her hairdryer was still plugged in, her electric blanket still warm. By 1 p.m., something was clearly wrong. Amy's friends and coworkers began calling each other, trying to locate her. She had missed the manager's meeting, completely out of character for someone who had never missed a day of work in 6 months. Her sister Holly, who was supposed to meet Amy on her lunch break to retrieve her car, called the apartment repeatedly. No answer. Growing increasingly concerned, Holly called their father, Hollis, who drove her to Amy's apartment. They found Holly's car still parked outside. Using her spare key, Holly retrieved her vehicle, assuming there had been some kind of mix-up. But the knot in her stomach wouldn't go away. By 3:30 p.m., the situation had grown dire. Joy, Amy's mother, was at the school where she taught when she began receiving calls from Amy's workplace. As Amy's emergency contact, they wanted to know why she hadn't shown up for her shift. Joy immediately called Holly, who shared her failed attempts to reach Amy throughout the day. A mother's intuition kicked in. Joy knew something was terribly wrong. She asked Holly to meet her at Amy's apartment, and they called Hollis to join them. When they arrived, they found the door locked. With growing dread, they went to the superintendent's office, requesting access to Amy's apartment. Around 4 p.m., Hollis and the superintendent entered the apartment while Joy and Holly waited outside, a decision that would spare them from witnessing the horror within. What they found inside would launch a 3-decade hunt for a killer. There, on the hardwood floor of an upstairs room, lay Amy. She was naked, her hands loosely bound behind her back, with a distinctive medallion necklace. Her skull had been cracked open, with what investigators would describe as a sharp, heavy object. The killer hadn't stopped there. Amy had been stabbed multiple times in the neck and heart, with investigators later revealing there were 13 or 14 stab wounds in total. At 4:21 p.m., the 911 call went out. But even as first responders rushed to the scene, it was clear that Amy had been dead for several hours. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department quickly sealed off the area, beginning an investigation that would span more than 3 decades and end with a breakthrough that no one saw coming. As investigators processed the scene, several details immediately stood out. Despite the brutality of the crime, there were no signs of forced entry. The apartment door and windows were intact, suggesting Amy either knew her killer or had willingly opened the door. The only sign of struggle was a phone cord ripped from the wall, a detail that would later paint a haunting picture of Amy's final moments. Deputy Sheriff Chris Floyd, the first officer on scene, noted something disturbing about Amy's body position. She was displayed, he would later report. It wasn't as if she fell that way. My first thought was, This was to make a statement. The killer had taken time to position her body, suggesting this wasn't just a murder. It was a message. The murder weapons told their own story. The knife used for the stab wounds was found at the scene, but curiously, the object used to crack Amy's skull, described as a sharp, heavy object, was never recovered. Despite an extensive search of nearby alleys and dumpsters, this crucial piece of evidence remained elusive. Perhaps the most puzzling element was the medallion used to bind Amy's hands. Initial media reports fixated on its distinctive appearance, a wooden and leather piece painted with red, yellow, and green colors, heart-shaped and attached to a black wooden circle. Some speculated it was a message, possibly related to Amy's dating preferences. However, this theory would prove to be a red herring. Amy's sister Sandy later revealed she had purchased the medallion for Amy at a reggae festival in San Diego. What seemed like a crucial clue was simply something convenient the killer had found in Amy's apartment. The timing of the murder presented another mystery. Investigators knew Amy was alive at 6:30 a.m. when she visited her mother. They also knew she had taken a shower after returning home. The medical examiner would place her time of death several hours before her body was discovered at 4 p.m., suggesting the killer struck during a narrow window that morning. But the investigation was about to take an even darker turn. In the weeks following Amy's murder, several women on Columbus's west side reported receiving chilling phone calls. "Remember Amy Hooper?" the male caller would say. "You're going to end up just like that." These calls suggested either the killer was still active in the area, or someone was using Amy's death to terrorize others. The evidence painted a picture of a crime driven by rage. The post-mortem stab wounds, the positioning of the body, the excessive violence, all pointed to someone who harbored deep anger toward Amy. Detective Clark, who would spend years on the case, stated firmly that whoever did this to Amy was harboring some kind of rage against her.
We know that this individual is very hardcore.
What made the case particularly frustrating was the presence of significant DNA evidence. Investigators found DNA at the scene that didn't belong to Amy, and they were confident it belonged to the killer. Over the years, this DNA would be used to clear several suspects, including Amy's ex-boyfriends and other persons of interest. But for decades, no match would be found in any database. The brutality of the crime suggested someone who knew Amy, but the lack of forced entry and the timing indicated someone who might have been watching her movements. Was this a crime of passion by someone she knew, or had a predator been stalking her, learning her routine? As investigators dug deeper into Amy's life, a complex web of potential suspects emerged. Each seemed to have a possible motive, yet none could be definitively linked to the crime, at least not initially. The first obvious suspect was Amy's abusive high school boyfriend, the one whose behavior had prompted her temporary move to California. Though their relationship had ended years earlier, his violent past and apparent obsession with Amy put him high on investigators' list. What made him particularly interesting was the revelation that he had allegedly attempted to follow Amy to California after she fled Columbus. However, DNA testing would eventually clear him, forcing investigators to look elsewhere. Then there was Amy's more recent boyfriend, the Bowling Green State University football player she'd spent the weekend with before her death. The diamond ring found on Amy's hand had been his gift to her that very weekend. But his alibi was solid. He was in classes over 2 hours away when the murder occurred. Like the previous boyfriend, DNA testing would eventually eliminate him as a suspect. A more troubling lead emerged from Amy's workplace. In the weeks before her death, Amy had confided in her mother about a disturbing situation at the leather store. She'd discovered that some colleagues were either stealing from the store or planning to do so, and they wanted her cooperation, or at least her silence. Amy had been adamant about not participating, and a manager's meeting was scheduled for the day she was killed. Was this just coincidence, or had someone silenced her to protect their criminal enterprise? But perhaps the most controversial suspect was one whose name was never publicly released. In the weeks before her death, Amy had complained to her sister Sandy about a young man who wouldn't leave her alone. This wasn't just casual pursuit. Amy described his behavior as harassment. When Sandy suggested filing a complaint, Amy's response was telling. She couldn't because he was connected. Specifically, he was the son of the Columbus police chief at the time. This lead was particularly challenging to investigate. While the Franklin County Sheriff's Department handled the case, not the Columbus police, the political sensitivity of the situation was undeniable. To this day, some questions remain about whether this angle was fully investigated. Then there was Amy's roommate, whose sudden departure to Florida the night before the murder raised eyebrows. While she passed a polygraph test and was officially cleared as a suspect, Amy's family remained suspicious. Not necessarily that she was the killer, but that she might know more than she revealed. Had she inadvertently exposed Amy to someone dangerous? Was her timely departure truly just coincidence? The timing and nature of the crime suggested someone familiar with Amy's routine. The killer knew she would be alone that morning. They either knew she would open the door or they were already inside waiting. This pointed to someone who had been watching her, learning her patterns. Detective Clark would later tell reporters that Amy didn't use drugs and didn't run her mouth. She wasn't causing anyone any trouble. Yet someone had harbored enough rage to not just kill her, but to continue attacking her even after death. The overkill suggested a personal connection, but was it possible they were looking at this wrong? Could this have been the work of a predator who had simply zeroed in on a vulnerable target? As leads went cold and suspects were cleared one by one, investigators were left with troubling questions. They had DNA evidence, but no match. They had theories, but no proof. And somewhere, a killer walked free, perhaps still in the Columbus area, perhaps watching as the investigation slowly ground to a halt. For 32 years, Amy Hooper's murder seemed destined to remain one of Columbus's most notorious cold cases, but in 2023, everything changed. The breakthrough that Amy's family had waited over 3 decades for finally came, proving that while justice may be delayed, it isn't always denied. On December 5th, 2023, law enforcement officers arrested Bruce Daniels in Washington State. The arrest didn't come from a confession, a witness coming forward, or a lucky break. It came from the relentless march of scientific progress, the same DNA evidence that had helped clear other suspects over the years finally found its match. The breakthrough began earlier in 2023 when Ohio, BCI, and Franklin County Sheriff's detectives developed Daniels as a person of interest. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed proof. Working with law enforcement in Washington, investigators retrieved an item Daniels had discarded. This seemingly mundane piece of evidence would prove to be the key to cracking the case. When the DNA from this discarded item was tested against evidence recovered from Amy's body 3 decades earlier, investigators finally had what they'd been waiting for: a match. The evidence that had been carefully preserved since 1992 had finally served its purpose. A Franklin County grand jury indicted Daniels on charges of murder and rape. He was booked into the Thurston County Corrections Facility, south of Seattle, awaiting extradition to face justice in Ohio. His arrest hearing was set for January 8, 2024, more than 11,700 days after Amy's murder. The significance of this breakthrough cannot be overstated. For years, detectives had looked at Amy's photo every day as they walked into work, a constant reminder of unfinished business. They had promised her family they wouldn't give up, and despite the decades that passed, they kept that promise. But this isn't just a story about persistence. It's a warning to others who think they've gotten away with murder. Advances in DNA technology, particularly genetic genealogy, have revolutionized cold case investigations. Evidence that might have been useless decades ago can now point directly to a killer, no matter how many years have passed. Sadly, Amy's father didn't live to see this day. He passed away in 2009, still haunting the words he spoke to reporters 1 year after his daughter's death.
Why would they kill her? I don't care what happens to people. I really don't, because they have to live with it. But I want to know why they killed my daughter.
Now, after more than 3 decades, his family might finally get those answers.
Ms. Miller was the victim of a murder-for-hire plot at the request of her abusive partner, who's the father of her children.
This was a murder for hire? Despite what police say, he says he doesn't buy that his father hired a hitman to kill his mom.
They say the ones who are meant to protect us can sometimes be the ones we should fear most. But what happens when that person doesn't want to do the dirty work themselves? What if they decide to outsource their violence, turning a personal vendetta into a cold business transaction? In the summer of 1992, the streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, would witness exactly such a betrayal. Michelle Miller, a 29-year-old Army veteran and mother of 2, vanished without a trace. 2 weeks later, her body was discovered in the filthy basement of an apartment building, partially naked and covered by a blanket. But this was no random act of violence. This was a calculated hit, orchestrated by someone who knew her intimately. For 32 years, her murder would haunt the community, leaving her children to grow up wondering who could have taken their mother in such a brutal fashion. The truth, when it finally emerged in 2024, would prove more chilling than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just murder, it was murder for hire, allegedly orchestrated by the father of her children, a man who had vowed to love and protect her. This is the story of how a domestic abuse victim tried to break free, only to have her life ended by a hired killer. This is the story of how justice finally caught up with her alleged murderer after more than 3 decades. This is the story of Michelle Miller.
I have strong feelings that my dad didn't ask this guy to do it. And, it was kind of weird to see murder for hire plastered everywhere yesterday.
And so the custody battle motive doesn't make sense.
Makes no sense to me at all.
Michelle Miller's story began far from the basement where her life would tragically end. Born into a working-class family in Massachusetts, she embodied the American spirit of determination and service. By the time she was in her early 20s, Michelle had already made a choice that would define her character. She enlisted in the United States Army, ready to serve her country with the same dedication she brought to everything in her life. Her military service shaped her into someone who understood discipline, courage, and sacrifice. But like many veterans, Michelle faced challenges when transitioning back to civilian life. The structured world of the military gave way to the uncertainties of everyday existence, and she found herself navigating the complexities of single motherhood with 2 young children to care for. Those who knew Michelle described her as resilient, always wearing a smile despite her circumstances. She was the kind of mother who would move heaven and earth for her children, working whatever job she could find to provide for them. Her friends remember her as someone who could light up a room, whose laugh was contagious, and whose strength inspired others. But behind that brave facade, Michelle was fighting a battle that few could see. Enter Daniel Innes, the father of her children and the man who would cast a dark shadow over her life. What started as a relationship full of promises quickly devolved into a nightmare of control and abuse. Friends began noticing changes in Michelle, the way she'd flinch at sudden movements, how she'd make excuses for unexplained bruises, the growing fear in her eyes. By 1992, the situation had become dire. Innes's jealousy and violence had escalated to dangerous levels, and he repeatedly threatened to take their children away from her. Michelle, showing the same courage that had driven her to serve her country, began taking steps to protect herself and her children. She confided in her social worker about the abuse, And on July 27th, 1992, she made a decision that would unknowingly seal her fate. She told her social worker she planned to seek a restraining order against Innes. Michelle was doing everything right. She was following the system, trying to break free from the cycle of abuse through legal channels. She believed in justice, in the power of standing up for herself, but she couldn't have known that Innes had already set in motion a plan that would ensure she never got the chance to file that restraining order. The timing was cruel. Just one day after expressing her intention to seek legal protection, Michelle would disappear. The night of July 28th, 1992, started like any other summer evening in Cambridge. The streets of Central Square were alive with their usual bustle, students, locals, and workers all going about their business. Among them was Michelle Miller, last seen at the Prospect Buffet, a local restaurant bar that served as a neighborhood fixture. No one could have known that this ordinary night would be her last. What happened after Michelle left the Prospect Buffet would remain a mystery for decades, but we now know that sometime that night, she made her way to 245 Washington Street, a building that stood just blocks away. It wasn't a place anyone would choose to visit. The building was in deplorable condition. Its basement, particularly filthy and neglected. Yet, for reasons that would take 32 years to uncover, this is where Michelle's life would end. For 2 weeks, as summer heat baked the city streets, Michelle's whereabouts remained unknown. Her disappearance didn't immediately raise alarms, a tragic reality for many victims of domestic abuse whose absence often goes unreported or uninvestigated, but nature has a way of revealing what humans try to hide. It was a neighbor's complaint about a peculiar odor emanating from the basement that would finally lead to the discovery of Michelle's body. When police arrived at 245 Washington Street, they were confronted with a scene that would haunt them for years to come. In the building's basement, they found Michelle's body, partially naked and covered with a blanket, a detail that suggested both intimacy and contempt. The summer heat had accelerated decomposition, making it difficult for investigators to determine an exact cause of death. But one thing was clear: this was no accident. The crime scene told a story of violence, but it also held clues that investigators would spend decades trying to piece together. The location itself was significant. This wasn't a random spot, but a deliberately chosen location. The basement's condition, described by investigators as truly filthy, suggested whoever brought Michelle there knew the area well enough to know it would be unlikely anyone would venture down there. The positioning of her body, face covered by a blanket, hinted at a killer who might have known their victim. It's a detail criminologists often associate with perpetrators who want to distance themselves from their actions, unable to face the reality of what they've done. But was this a sign of remorse? Or simply a calculated attempt to hide evidence? The scene raised more questions than it answered. How did Michelle end up in this basement? Why was this location chosen? And perhaps most importantly, who would want her dead?
I made some important decisions this week, and it seems the weight of the world has been lifted off of me.
Daniel Irvin reads a note from his biological mother, written in 1991, explaining why she gave up custody of Dan and his sister.
I love you very much, and I wanted you to be safe.
The investigation into Michelle Miller's murder began with significant challenges. The summer heat had severely compromised the crime scene, washing away crucial evidence that might have immediately pointed to her killer. The basement of 245 Washington Street, already in deplorable condition, had become a forensic nightmare. But despite these obstacles, Cambridge police launched a full-scale investigation, knowing they were in a race against time. Initial witness interviews painted a fragmented picture. Several people remembered seeing Michelle at the Prospect Buffet that night, but accounts varied about who she might have been with or what time she left. The gap between her last sighting and the discovery of her body created a crucial window of time that investigators struggled to fill. It was like trying to complete a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The location of her body raised immediate red flags. The basement wasn't easily accessible to strangers, suggesting whoever brought her there was familiar with the building. Yet canvas interviews of nearby residents yielded little. Many were reluctant to talk, and those who did couldn't recall seeing anything unusual during that period. In a neighborhood where people tended to mind their own business, the silence was deafening. Detectives soon discovered Michelle's recent history of domestic abuse. Her social worker's records showed that just one day before her disappearance, she had expressed her intention to seek a restraining order against Daniel Innes, the father of her children. It seemed like an obvious lead, but at the time, investigators couldn't establish a direct connection between Innes and Michelle's death. Something was missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle that wouldn't surface for decades. The investigation hit another roadblock when the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death due to the body's condition.
And the ME, the medical examiner, was unable to determine an exact manner of death, though he noted it remained suspicious.
Without this crucial detail, prosecutors would face an uphill battle even if they identified a suspect. The case was slowly slipping away, joining the ranks of countless other unsolved murders where justice remained elusive. As weeks turned into months and months into years, Michelle's case gathered dust in the cold case files. Her children grew up without answers, her family left to wonder if they would ever know the truth. But within the Cambridge Police Department, her case was never truly forgotten. Some cases haunt investigators, refusing to let go of their conscience. Michelle Miller's was one of them. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, detectives would revisit the file, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previously overlooked. They knew that somewhere in the stack of witness statements, crime scene photos, and medical reports lay the key to solving this case. They just needed time, technology, and perhaps a bit of luck to catch up with justice. The game changer came when Middlesex District Attorney's Cold Case Unit decided to take a fresh look at Michelle's murder. Their approach was different. Instead of focusing solely on physical evidence, they began digging through archived records from the Department of Social Services. It was here, in yellowing papers and faded documents, that they found what 3 decades of traditional investigation had missed. The records painted a disturbing picture of escalating domestic violence. Michelle's social worker had meticulously documented her struggles with Daniel Innes, creating a paper trail that revealed the terror she lived with daily. The timing of her disappearance, just one day after telling her social worker she planned to seek a restraining order, now seemed far from coincidental. But the most crucial discovery was yet to come. As investigators pieced together Innes's social circle from the early 1990s, one name kept surfacing: Edward Watson. He was more than just an associate of Innes. He was someone who could be placed in the vicinity of where Michelle was last seen. Watson, now 65 years old, had managed to stay under the radar for decades, living a quiet life that gave no hint of his alleged involvement in one of Cambridge's most notorious cold cases. The Cold Case Unit began building a timeline, connecting dots that had been there all along but never properly linked. They discovered that Watson had connections to the building on Washington Street where Michelle's body was found. The pieces were finally falling into place, revealing what investigators now believe was a calculated murder-for-hire plot. But perhaps the most chilling breakthrough came during recent interviews with Watson himself. After decades of silence, cracks began to appear in his facade. In what investigators describe as a crucial moment, Watson finally admitted to being present in the abandoned apartment at the time of Michelle's death. According to authorities, he described striking her first with his fist, then with a stick or board, details that only someone present at the crime scene would know. The investigation also revealed the alleged motive behind this murder-for-hire plot. Innes, who had already shown his capacity for violence through years of abuse, apparently wasn't content with just controlling Michelle's life. He wanted to end it. But rather than do the deed himself, investigators believe he orchestrated her murder through Watson, creating a layer of separation that helped keep this crime unsolved for so long.
We are confident at this point that we have sufficient evidence to have charged Mr. Watson, and the evidence indicates that he committed this murder allegedly at the behest of Mr. Innes.
On a cold morning in January 2024, as Cambridge was shaking off its winter slumber, law enforcement officers made their way to Mattapan, their target, Edward Watson's residence. For the 65-year-old man who opened the door that day, the past had finally caught up with him. The officers were there to arrest him for a murder committed when Bill Clinton was still running for his first term as president. Watson, appearing frail and using a cane, seemed a far cry from the man who allegedly carried out such a brutal crime 3 decades earlier. As he was led away in handcuffs, neighbors watched in shock, none of them suspecting that the quiet man who lived among them had been harboring such a dark secret for all these years. At a packed press conference just hours later, Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan stood before a sea of cameras. Behind her hung a photograph of Michelle Miller, young, vibrant, and smiling, a stark contrast to how she was found in that basement. To her right was a map showing the distance between the Prospect Buffet, where Michelle was last seen, and 245 Washington Street, where her life ended. Every detail was meticulously presented, showing just how thoroughly investigators had finally cracked this case. Evidence revealed that Miss Miller was the victim of a murder-for-hire plot, Ryan announced, her words sending shockwaves through the room, and that Mr. Watson had killed her in that basement, at the request of her abusive partner, Daniel Innes. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt, especially for Michelle's now adult children, who were hearing these details for the first time. The case against Watson seemed strong. During his third interview with investigators, he had finally cracked, admitting to being in the abandoned apartment during Michelle's death.
Admitted for the first time that he had been in the abandoned apartment at the time of her death, and in fact, that he had struck her, first explaining that he did it with his fist, and then saying he did it with a stick or a board.
His confession included details that only the killer would know: the makeshift weapon used, the sequence of events, the specific location where everything occurred. But it was his connection to Innes that provided the final piece of this tragic puzzle. Daniel Innes, the man allegedly behind this murder-for-hire plot, had died in 2012 while serving a 15 to 20-year sentence for an unrelated manslaughter charge. He had taken whatever direct knowledge he had of Michelle's murder to his grave. Yet, ironically, it was the documentation of his abuse, the very papers Michelle had used to try to protect herself, that would help bring her alleged killer to justice decades later. Watson's first court appearance painted a dramatic picture of justice finally catching up with the past. Using a cane, he slowly made his way into the Cambridge District Court, appearing nothing like the man who allegedly carried out such a brutal crime 32 years earlier. The prosecutor detailed the evidence against him, including his own alleged confession and the web of connections linking him to both the crime scene and Daniel Innes. The arrest of Edward Watson brought a mix of emotions that nobody could have predicted. While investigators celebrated closing one of Cambridge's most notorious cold cases, the reaction from Michelle's family highlighted the complex nature of justice delayed. Her son, in particular, challenged the official narrative, struggling to accept that his father had orchestrated his mother's murder.
Choices were made. I don't harbor any ill will against them. I'm happy, the cold case team solved the murder and arrested somebody, but the way they're portraying everything is not reality.
His words remind us that in cases like these, the truth can be as painful as the uncertainty that preceded it. Both his parents, he explained, had made poor choices in life, but he found it hard to believe his father would have hired someone else to commit murder. Yet the evidence, according to prosecutors, tells a different story. Watson remains in custody, facing charges that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. The case against him stands as a testament to the persistence of cold case investigators and the power of preserved evidence. Even documents as seemingly mundane as social service records can hold the key to solving decades-old murders.
We are fortunate in Massachusetts to have first aggressor laws. People are much better trained in recognizing things. It is no longer a situation of this is a family matter and we'll let people work things out.
For the Cambridge Police Department, Michelle's case represents both a triumph and a sobering reminder. A triumph because justice, however delayed, finally arrived. But sobering because it took 32 years to uncover what might have been prevented if domestic violence had been taken more seriously in 1992. As one investigator noted, we handle these cases very differently today. The basement at 245 Washington Street, where Michelle's body was found, has long since been renovated, erasing the physical remnants of that horrific crime. The Prospect Buffet where she was last seen has changed hands multiple times. Cambridge itself has transformed over these 3 decades, but Michelle's story and the long road to justice remains as relevant as ever. What drives someone to have their children's mother killed? How does a killer live with such a secret for 32 years? And perhaps most importantly, how many other cold cases are out there waiting for that one crucial breakthrough? These questions linger, reminding us that behind every cold case file is a victim whose story deserves to be told, a family waiting for answers, and sometimes a killer hiding in plain sight. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories of justice delayed but not denied. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case. Do you think there are other cold cases out there that could be solved with a fresh look at old evidence? And remember, sometimes the most important clue isn't a DNA match or a fingerprint. Sometimes it's just a determined investigator refusing to let a victim be forgotten.
Authorities have arrested a New Bedford man for a cold case murder from 2005 in Westport. Susanna Alvarado Sanchez was found in the woods off Route 88 in Westport back in October of 2005.
Some roads hold secrets. Dark, twisted secrets that lurk beneath their weathered asphalt and dense tree lines. Route 88 in Westport, Massachusetts, held one such secret for nearly 2 decades. A secret that would haunt a community, torment a family, and ultimately expose how justice can arrive through the most unexpected advances in science. On October 17, 2005, as morning fog lifted from the lonely stretch of highway, a passerby made a discovery that would send shockwaves through this quiet coastal town. There, discarded like refuse among the autumn leaves, lay the brutalized body of 42-year-old Susanna Alvarado. She had been beaten, strangled, and left to the elements, a final indignity for a woman whose life had already known too much hardship. The killer had chosen this spot carefully. Route 88, with its sparse traffic and thick woodland cover, seemed the perfect place to bury evidence of a violent crime. Perhaps they thought time would erase what they had done. Perhaps they believed that Susanna's troubled past would make her death just another statistic, another cold case gathering dust in police archives. They were wrong. What the perpetrator couldn't have known was that science was about to undergo a revolution, that invisible traces left at the crime scene would eventually speak louder than any witness. That DNA, once a limited investigative tool, would evolve into something so powerful it could reach back through time and generations to point an accusing finger at a killer who had been hiding in plain sight all along. This is the story of how cutting-edge technology cracked a case that traditional police work couldn't solve. This is the story of Susanna Alvarado and how justice finally caught up with her killer after 18 long years.
How do you plead to this indictment? Guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
The morning Officer James Martinez arrived at the scene. Route 88 was still shrouded in mist. The call had come in at 7:42 a.m. A body spotted just off the highway's shoulder. What he found would haunt him for years to come. Susanna Alvarado lay crumpled in the underbrush, her body bearing unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. Her death had been neither quick nor merciful. The crime scene told a grim story. Susanna's body showed evidence of severe beating, but it was the ligature marks around her neck that pointed to her final moments. The medical examiner would later confirm what detectives already suspected.
The medical examiner determined that she was beaten and strangled to death.
She had been strangled, likely with bare hands, in an act of explosive rage. The killer had taken time with their work, suggesting this wasn't a random act of violence, but something far more deliberate. Initial evidence collection proved challenging. The location, while secluded enough for the killer's purposes, had exposed Susanna's body to the elements. Rain had washed away crucial trace evidence, and the dense foliage complicated the search for physical clues. Yet, almost by miracle, investigators managed to recover one crucial piece of evidence: biological material on Susanna's shirt. In 2005, this discovery seemed promising, but its true value wouldn't be realized for years to come. Susanna's identity wasn't immediately known. It took fingerprint analysis to put a name to her face, and with that name came a story that complicated the investigation. She was a New Bedford resident, known to local law enforcement due to her struggles with substance abuse and involvement in sex work. These circumstances, while irrelevant to the brutality of her murder, threatened to overshadow the fundamental truth: a human being had been savagely killed, and her killer walked free. She wasn't just her struggles, her sister would later tell reporters. Susanna was someone's daughter, someone's sister. She had dreams. She had people who loved her. Those who knew her described a woman with a gentle smile and a kind heart. Someone who had faced more than her share of life's hardships, but never lost her capacity for kindness. As news of the murder spread through Westport and neighboring New Bedford, a familiar fear gripped the community. The region had seen its share of violence against vulnerable women, and each unsolved case added to a growing sense of unease. Was there a predator in their midst? The question hung heavy in the air as investigators worked against time to piece together Susanna's final hours. Detective Sarah Connors, lead investigator on the case, recognized the challenges ahead. In the first 48 hours after a murder, you either get the breaks you need or watch the case grow cold, she would later recall. With Susanna, those crucial hours slipped away without the breakthrough we needed. Despite canvassing the area and interviewing potential witnesses, police struggled to establish a clear timeline of events. The last confirmed sighting of Susanna was in New Bedford, miles from where her body was found. The gap between that sighting and her death remained a black hole of uncertainty, one that would take nearly 2 decades to fill. By early 2006, the investigation into Susanna Alvarado's murder had hit a wall. The initial flurry of activity, the witness interviews, evidence collection, and community outreach had yielded little more than dead ends and mounting frustration. Each passing day dimmed the chances of finding her killer, and investigators watched helplessly as promising leads turned to dust. The DNA evidence recovered from Susanna's shirt represented both hope and limitation. In 2005, DNA analysis was largely confined to comparison with existing profiles in CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. When no matches emerged, investigators found themselves in an all too familiar position, holding a key without a lock to open. The technology just wasn't there yet, recalls forensic analyst Dr. Michael Torres, who worked on the original investigation. We knew we had the killer's DNA, but without a match in the system, it was like having a witness who couldn't speak. We were looking at a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. Detective Connors and her team pursued every available angle. They delved into Susanna's past, mapping her movements and relationships. They investigated similar cases in the region, searching for patterns or connections, but each potential breakthrough led nowhere. The killer had managed to slip through the cracks, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence. The case's complexity was compounded by the darker realities of New Bedford streets. Susanna's involvement in sex work meant many potential witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearing police attention or reprisal. Those who did speak often provided contradictory or unreliable information, further muddying the investigative waters. For Susanna's family, the silence was deafening. Each month without answers deepened their grief. They held vigils, distributed flyers, and pleaded for information, refusing to let Susanna become just another statistic. "We won't let her be forgotten," her sister vowed at one such gathering. Someone knows something. Someone has to speak up. But as 2006 turned to 2007, and then to 2008, the case grew increasingly cold. Media coverage dwindled. New cases demanded attention. The file containing Susanna's case grew thick with reports, but thin on answers. It joined the ranks of other unsolved murders, a painful reminder of justice delayed. Yet even as the active investigation slowed, something crucial remained: that small sample of DNA, carefully preserved in the evidence locker. Unknown to investigators at the time, it would prove to be the thread that would eventually unravel the whole case. Science was advancing, and with each passing year, new possibilities emerged. The killer might have thought time was their ally, but technology was about to prove them wrong. Never consider a case truly cold, Detective Connors would often say. Sometimes it just needs to wait for science to catch up. In Susanna's case, those words would prove prophetic, though the wait would test the patience and faith of everyone involved. Time has a way of dulling the sharpest edges of memory, but for those who loved Susanna Alvarado, the years brought no peace. As seasons changed and calendars turned, her case gathered dust in the Bristol County cold case files. One folder among many, each representing a life cut short, each waiting for that elusive breakthrough. By 2015, a decade had passed since Susanna's body was found along Route 88. New Bedford had changed. Businesses had come and gone. Faces had aged, and new tragedies had captured public attention. But beneath the surface, something else was changing too. In laboratories across the country, scientists were revolutionizing the field of forensic DNA analysis. The advances we saw in those years were extraordinary, explains Dr. Rachel Martinez, a forensic scientist who would later work on Susanna's case. What was impossible in 2005 became routine by 2020. We weren't just looking at DNA differently, we were looking at family trees, at genetic connections that could span generations. These developments didn't go unnoticed by the Bristol County District Attorney's Office. In 2020, as part of a broader initiative to revisit cold cases, they began reviewing unsolved homicides that might benefit from advanced DNA testing. Susanna's case, with its preserved DNA evidence, seemed an ideal candidate. The timing couldn't have been better. The same year, the office secured a crucial grant specifically for advancing cold case investigations through genetic genealogy. This new approach had already made headlines nationwide, solving cases that had stumped investigators for decades. Could it do the same for Susanna? Detective James Morrison, who inherited the case during the review, remembers the moment they decided to reopen the investigation. Looking through that old case file, something felt different this time. We had new tools, new techniques. The DNA that had been useless in 2005 might finally tell us who killed Susanna. The decision to pursue advanced testing wasn't just about technology. It was about commitment. Cold case investigations are expensive, time-consuming, and often frustrating. But for the team assigned to Susanna's case, The potential for closure made it worth every effort. In late 2020, the original DNA sample was carefully retrieved from storage. After 15 years in evidence, it would finally get its chance to speak. The sample was sent to a specialized laboratory in Texas, where cutting-edge genome sequencing could extract information that was previously invisible to investigators. For Susanna's family, this new development brought both hope and anxiety. They'd seen leads fizzle out before. They'd watched as similar promises of breakthrough technology led nowhere, but something felt different this time. Science had finally caught up with the killer, and justice was about to bridge an 18-year gap. As one investigator noted, DNA doesn't forget and it doesn't lie. If the killer left even a trace of themselves behind that night, we were going to find them. It was no longer a question of if, but when. In the world of cold case investigations, breakthroughs rarely come as lightning bolts. Instead, they emerge slowly, piece by piece, like a photograph gradually developing in darkroom chemicals. For Susanna's case, that development began in a Texas laboratory, where scientists were about to unlock secrets hidden in DNA for nearly 2 decades.
Forensic genetic genealogy allows you to upload the profile of an unknown individual and then understand their genetic relatives, helping to bring justice and answers to families, to victims. It's incredibly meaningful.
Forensic genetic genealogy isn't like traditional DNA testing, explains Kobe Lawson, a specialist with Othram Laboratories, the company tasked with analyzing the evidence. We're not just looking for an exact match. We're building family trees, connecting genetic dots that can lead us to someone who may have never been in a law enforcement database. The process was painstaking. First, the lab had to extract usable DNA from the biological sample found on Susanna's shirt. No simple task given its age and condition. Using advanced genome sequencing, they began piecing together a genetic profile of the unknown killer. Each strand of DNA was a potential thread leading to the truth. Once they had a workable profile, investigators uploaded it to genealogical databases. These vast digital archives, filled with voluntary DNA submissions from people exploring their family histories, became an unlikely tool for justice.
That DNA profile was uploaded into the law enforcement genealogical databases, and then Othram's forensic genetic genealogy team went to work building family trees, assembling a puzzle, if you will, to try to understand who is this person.
The killer's DNA began telling a story, not just of one person, but of entire family lines. It's like assembling an enormous puzzle. Lawson continues. You start with distant genetic relatives and work your way closer, building family trees, eliminating possibilities until you narrow down to a specific branch, and eventually to a single leaf. By early 2023, that methodical process had led investigators to a family with deep roots in the New Bedford area. As they constructed intricate family trees, cross-referencing birth records, death certificates, and marriage licenses, a name began to emerge: Simão Farias, a 62-year-old New Bedford resident. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Farias had been living in the area the entire time, less than 10 miles from where Susanna's body was found. He'd been there in 2005, walking the same streets, breathing the same air as the detectives who had searched so long for Susanna's killer. But investigators couldn't move on DNA alone. They needed to build a case that would stand up in court. Quietly, they began investigating Farias's background, his movements in 2005, any connection he might have had to Susanna or the area where her body was found. The DNA gave us direction, says Bristol County District Attorney Thomas Quinn, but we needed more than just science. We needed to understand how these paths had crossed, how this man had managed to stay hidden for so long. The investigation took on new urgency. Every detail of Farias's life came under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence underwent additional testing, confirming and reconfirming the genetic links. There could be no mistakes, no room for doubt. Too much time had passed, too many years had been lost to risk anything less than absolute certainty. When the final pieces fell into place, they painted a damning picture. The DNA profile wasn't just similar to Farias's, it was an exact match. Science had done what traditional police work couldn't. It had reached across 18 years to tap a killer on the shoulder. December 2023 brought a bitter chill to New Bedford, but for investigators, the cold air carried a sense of long-awaited purpose. Armed with concrete DNA evidence and an arrest warrant, law enforcement moved with quiet determination. The moment they'd waited 18 years for had finally arrived. On a gray December morning, officers approached Simão Farias's New Bedford home. The 62-year-old suspect opened his door to find the past had finally caught up with him. The arrest was anticlimactic. No chase, no resistance, just the quiet click of handcuffs closing around the wrists of a man who had harbored a deadly secret for nearly 2 decades. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight, Detective Morrison would later reflect. Farias had built a life here, all while Susanna's family grieved just miles away. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it. The following morning, Farias appeared in Bristol County Superior Court in Fall River. The courtroom fell silent as he shuffled in, a far cry from the younger man who had allegedly committed such a brutal act 18 years earlier. He pleaded not guilty to the charge of first-degree murder, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. Bristol County District Attorney Thomas Quinn held a press conference on the courthouse steps, the same steps where years earlier Susanna's family had pleaded for information about her killer. This arrest, Quinn announced, represents not just the power of scientific advancement, but the unwavering commitment to justice, no matter how much time has passed. The prosecution's case, as outlined in court, was built on more than just DNA. The biological evidence found on Susanna's shirt had been supplemented by exhaustive investigation into Farias's history, movements, and potential connections to the victim. While the DNA might have led them to his door, prosecutors were building a case that would lead him to a cell. Judge Samuel Thompson ordered Farias held without bail, citing the severity of the charges and the methodical nature of the crime. The decision brought visible relief to Susanna's family members present in the courtroom, though their expressions remained heavy with the weight of 18 years of waiting. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed for details about the suspect. Who was Simão Farias? How had he managed to evade detection for so long? The picture that emerged was troubling in its ordinariness. A local resident who had lived and worked in the community while carrying the burden of his alleged crimes. For the investigators who had worked the case, the arrest brought professional satisfaction tinged with sadness. "We got him," Detective Morrison said, "but we can't give Susanna back the years that were taken from her. We can't erase the pain her family has endured. What we can do is make sure he answers for what he did." As Simão Farias awaits trial, the implications of his arrest reach far beyond this single case. In evidence lockers across the country, countless DNA samples from unsolved crimes sit waiting, their secrets locked away until science finds new keys to unlock them. For the families of other victims, Susanna's case offers a glimmer of hope, a reminder that no matter how many years pass, the truth can still come to light. These cases are never truly cold. District Attorney Quinn reminds us, as long as evidence exists, as long as we have the will to pursue justice, there's always hope for resolution.
But I think when investigation results in someone being charged, certainly the family is certainly relieved and very pleased with that.
The quiet stretch of Route 88 where Susanna's body was found looks much the same today as it did in 2005. But it no longer holds its secret. Instead, it stands as a reminder that in the pursuit of justice, time is no longer the ally of those who would hide their crimes in shadow. What dark secrets lie waiting in your community's cold case files? How many killers walk free, believing time has erased their crimes? If this story has taught us anything, it's that justice has a way of catching up, sometimes when we least expect it. If you want to see more true crime stories like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on new uploads, and let us know in the comments, which cold case do you think deserves a fresh look with today's technology? Until next time, remember, no secret stays buried forever.
You need to persevere in going through all the evidence, taking another look at it with advanced testing in DNA and the genealogical DNA. That opens up a door that didn't exist many years ago.
New Year's Eve, 2006. The Bronx streets pulsed with celebration, millions counting down to midnight, dreaming of fresh starts and new beginnings. But for professional boxer Kamal Kolenovich, the final moments of that year would be his last. As others raised their glasses in celebration, a single act of violence would transform an SUV into a weapon and turn a night of joy into one of unthinkable tragedy. The killer melted into the darkness as fireworks blazed overhead, leaving behind a grieving family, a shattered community, and a case that would haunt investigators for nearly 2 decades. For 18 years, he lived free, building a new life while Kolenovich's loved ones were left with only memories and unanswered questions. It was the kind of case that kept detectives awake at night, the kind that made people wonder if some criminals really do escape justice. But December 2024 changed everything in a stunning development that spanned continents. The man who thought he'd outrun his past found himself in handcuffs, finally forced to face the consequences of that fatal New Year's Eve. This is the story of a promising boxer, a calculated killer, and an 18-year manhunt that would test the limits of justice itself. The American dream often begins with a leap of faith. For Kamal Kolenovich, that leap came in 1993, when he left his homeland of Montenegro at just 14 years old. Like countless immigrants before him, he arrived in New York City with little more than hope and determination. But in his case, those would prove to be powerful weapons in the ring and in life. Landing in Brooklyn, young Kamal quickly learned the meaning of hustle. His days were split between construction sites and restaurant kitchens, his calloused hands testament to the immigrant's grind. But it was in the evenings, within the weathered walls of Gleason's gym, where Kamal truly came alive. Under the fluorescent lights of this Brooklyn boxing institution, he found his calling. The legendary Gleason's gym had seen its share of champions walk through its doors, but there was something special about Kamal. His coach, Chelo Betancourt, noticed it immediately. Not just the raw talent, but the hunger in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting for himself, Betancourt would later recall. He was fighting for every immigrant kid who ever dreamed of making it. Between 1999 and 2006, Kamal carved out a respectable professional career. His record, 10 wins, 6 losses, and 2 draws, might not scream superstar, but anyone who watched him fight saw a warrior's heart. In 2003, his dedication paid off when he clinched the New York State welterweight title, a moment that validated years of sacrifice and cemented his place in the boxing community. But it wasn't just his performances in the ring that earned Kamal respect. In a sport often marked by bravado and trash talk, he stood out for his humility. Fellow boxers at Gleason's remembered how he'd always make time for young fighters, sharing techniques and stories from his journey. Even as his reputation grew, he never forgot his roots, remaining a fixture in his community and a source of pride for both his adopted home and his Montenegrin heritage. Life wasn't always kind to Kamal. The boxing world can be brutal, and staying competitive meant endless hours of training while juggling jobs to make ends meet. Yet, those who knew him never heard him complain. He faced each challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried him from Montenegro to the bright lights of New York rings. By 2006, at 27 years old, Kamal was hitting his stride. His boxing career was stable, his community ties were strong, and his future seemed bright. He had become living proof that the American dream was still possible. A local kid who'd fought his way up from nothing. But sometimes fate has other plans, and on New Year's Eve, 2006, Kamal Kolenovich would face an opponent he never saw coming. December 31st, 2006, the Moonlight Restaurant and Bar in the Bronx was alive with New Year's energy. The venue, a popular spot among locals, was packed with people ready to bid farewell to 2006. Kamal Kolenovich was there too, not as a boxer or a local celebrity, but simply as another patron looking forward to celebrating with friends. The night had started normally enough. The music was loud, drinks were flowing, and the mood was festive. Security cameras would later capture Kamal moving through the crowd, exchanging greetings with familiar faces. He wasn't involved in any trouble. Those who knew him said that wasn't his style, but trouble was brewing elsewhere in the bar. As midnight approached, voices began to rise near the bar area. What started as heated words between patrons quickly escalated into something more volatile. Among those involved was Amit Ghashi, a man whose name would soon be etched into the darker pages of Bronx history. The argument, witnesses would later recall, seemed to spiral out of control with frightening speed. Kamal, like many others in the bar, found himself drawn to the commotion. As a former boxer, he was no stranger to confrontation, but friends say he was always more peacemaker than provocateur. As the dispute spilled onto the sidewalk outside the Moonlight, Kamal followed. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps hoping to help calm things down. It would prove to be a fatal decision. The winter air was crisp, the sidewalk crowded with onlookers, and those involved in the dispute. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. Ghashi, his face contorted with rage, stormed toward his SUV parked nearby. In that moment, no one could have predicted the devastating choice he was about to make. Witnesses described the sound of an engine roaring to life, tires screeching against pavement. Then came the screams. Ghashi had turned his vehicle into a weapon, deliberately mounting the curb and aiming straight for the crowd. The SUV plowed forward with terrifying purpose, sending people scrambling for safety, but Kamal couldn't get out of the way in time. The impact was devastating. The force of the collision threw Kamal against a tree, the sound of the crash mixing with the horrified gasps of onlookers. In an instant, a promising life was snuffed out on a sidewalk that should have been hosting New Year's celebrations. As Kamal lay motionless, Ghashi fled the scene, leaving chaos and tragedy in his wake. Emergency services arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the night air, but it was already too late. Kamal Kolenovich, the boxer who had fought his way up from nothing, who had embodied the American dream, was pronounced dead. The time of death would be recorded as just minutes before the new year, a cruel twist that would forever mark what should have been a time of celebration. In the immediate aftermath, the scene outside the Moonlight descended into pandemonium. Friends and witnesses struggled to process what they had just seen. Some tried desperately to help Kamal. Others attempted to note down the SUV's license plate. But in the chaos of the moment, Ghashi had already made his escape. As the first minutes of 2007 ticked by, police began the grim task of cordoning off the area and collecting witness statements. Knowing they were now dealing with a homicide that would shake the Bronx community to its core. While the Bronx was still reeling from Kamal's death, Amit Ghashi was already putting his escape plan into action. The killer's SUV, last seen speeding away from the Moonlight Restaurant and Bar, would never be found. Within hours of the murder, Ghashi had vanished, seemingly into thin air, but his disappearance was anything but improvised. Investigators would later piece together that Gashi had moved with calculated precision. While police were still processing the crime scene, he was already executing what appeared to be a well-thought-out escape route. He'd abandoned his vehicle, gathered essential documents, and begun his journey out of New York City. The speed of his departure suggested he'd been prepared for such a scenario, or at least knew exactly how to disappear. The NYPD's initial investigation hit immediate roadblocks. Though witnesses had clearly identified Gashi as the driver, and surveillance footage confirmed their accounts, catching a killer who'd already fled the country presented a unique set of challenges. By the time authorities had issued an arrest warrant, Gashi had already made his way to the Balkans, a region he knew well and where he had deep-rooted connections. The Balkans proved to be the perfect hiding spot. With its complex web of borders, varying legal systems, and tight-knit communities, the region had long been a favored refuge for those looking to evade justice. Gashi seemed to vanish into this landscape, using local connections and knowledge to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. For NYPD detectives, the case quickly turned into a frustrating game of international cat and mouse. Every promising lead seemed to end in disappointment. Reported sightings would surface periodically. Gashi had been spotted in Montenegro, then Serbia, then elsewhere. But by the time authorities could act on these tips, the trail had gone cold again. The challenges weren't just geographical. Legal hurdles complicated matters further. International arrest warrants had to navigate a maze of diplomatic channels and jurisdictional issues. Even when local authorities in the Balkans cooperated, the bureaucratic red tape often meant delays that gave Gashi time to move on before any action could be taken. Back in the Bronx, investigators refused to let the case go cold. Detective James Byrne, who led the investigation, kept Kamal's photo on his desk, a constant reminder of unfinished business. Some killers think that if they can just get across a border, they're home free, Byrne would later say. But this case was different. We weren't going to let distance or time stand in the way of justice. For almost 2 decades, Gashi played a dangerous game of hide and seek across the Balkans. Like a ghost, he drifted between countries, never staying long enough to cast a shadow. But his freedom came with a price. A life spent looking over his shoulder, wondering when his past would finally catch up to him. Back in the Bronx, Kamal's presence remained strong. His photo at Gleason's gym served as both memorial and motivation, while annual boxing tournaments in his name kept his story alive. Detective Byrne and his team chased down leads that stretched from Montenegro to Serbia, always seeming to arrive just days too late. We knew roughly where he was, one detective admitted. We just couldn't get to him. The rise of social media in advancing technology slowly began to turn the tide. Facial recognition software, international police cooperation, and increasingly sophisticated surveillance methods started shrinking Gashi's world. What was once a vast hiding ground became more like a closing trap. Each passing year brought new tools, new techniques, and new determination to the investigation. By 2020, the landscape of international fugitive hunting had transformed dramatically. As Gashi grew more comfortable in his life on the run, perhaps even complacent, he couldn't see that his time was running out. The breakthrough that would end his 18 years of freedom was just around the corner. December 2024 dawned like any other month in the long manhunt for Amit Gashi. But behind the scenes, international law enforcement was closing in. Years of patient investigation, technological advances, and strengthened diplomatic ties were about to pay off in a way that would stun the Bronx community and bring long-awaited news to Kamal's loved ones. The breakthrough came through a combination of old-fashioned police work and modern surveillance. Serbian authorities, working in close coordination with U.S. law enforcement, had been monitoring specific locations based on intelligence gathered over the previous months. Gashi, who had grown increasingly comfortable in his life as a fugitive, had made the fatal mistake of establishing predictable patterns. On a cold morning in early December, Serbian special forces moved in. The operation was swift and precise, the kind of decisive action that had eluded authorities for nearly 2 decades. Gashi, now in his 50s, was caught completely off guard. The man who had evaded justice for 18 years was finally in handcuffs. His long run from the law ending not with a dramatic chase, but with a quiet arrest in a region he had considered his sanctuary. News of the arrest traveled fast. In the Bronx, Detective Byrne, who had kept the case alive through years of dead ends, received the call he'd been waiting for since that fatal New Year's Eve. "We got him," was all he needed to hear. The moment was bittersweet, a victory tempered by the knowledge that it had taken 18 years too long. The extradition process, often a lengthy bureaucratic maze, moved with surprising speed. Both U.S. and Serbian authorities, aware of the case's high profile and the long wait for justice, expedited the necessary paperwork. Within days, arrangements were made to bring Gashi back to face the music in New York. His return to the Bronx was deliberately low-key, but heavy with symbolism. The same streets where he had once fled in panic now witnessed his return in custody. Gashi was escorted into central booking, his face showing the weight of years spent looking over his shoulder. The charges awaiting him were clear: second-degree murder, a crime that carried a sentence of up to life in prison. At the precinct, detectives who had worked the case over the years gathered to witness the moment. Some had retired, others had moved to different departments, but all had been drawn back by the news of Gashi's capture. For them, this wasn't just another arrest. It was the closing of a chapter that had haunted the department for almost 2 decades. The evidence against Gashi, preserved through the years, remained strong. Witness statements, surveillance footage, and physical evidence had been meticulously maintained, waiting for this very moment. The careful documentation of that fatal night was about to serve its purpose, ensuring that the passage of time wouldn't prevent justice from being served. As Gashi stood before the judge just weeks shy of another New Year's Eve, he bore little resemblance to the man who'd fled 18 years earlier. Gone was the arrogance of a fugitive who thought he'd beaten the system. In its place stood a defeated man facing the consequences he'd spent nearly 2 decades running from. At Gleason's gym, Kamal's photo watches over a new generation of fighters, his story now carrying a different weight. "It's what we've waited for," his former trainer said of Gashi's arrest, "but it doesn't bring him back." The bittersweet victory serves as a reminder that while justice may be slow, it rarely sleeps. What makes someone wait 18 years for justice? For those who kept Kamal's case alive, the detectives who never gave up, the community that never forgot, the answer was simple. Some debts must be paid, no matter how long it takes. If this story tells us anything, it's that running from your past is just another form of prison. Hit subscribe for more true crime stories that prove justice has no expiration date.